My parents proudly announced they were cutting me out of their will and handing my sister our $5 million family estate right in the middle of a crowded Michelin-starred restaurant. My mother smirked over her champagne and called me their biggest disappointment. 3 years later, my lawyer called theirs. When my father heard what I had built entirely on my own, he dropped his phone and could not stop repeating that it was impossible. I am Sydney, 33 years old, and I spent my entire life being the punchline to my family's cruel jokes. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. We were sitting in a private dining room at one of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants, celebrating my mother, Patricia's 60th birthday. The air smelled of roasted truffles and heavily aged wine. For 2 excruciating hours, I sat in silence while my family fiercely celebrated themselves. My younger sister Madison sat across from me, dripping in designer labels she could barely afford. Next to her was her husband Terrence. Terrence was a handsome, smooth-talking African-American man who styled himself as a high-rolling venture capitalist. He wore a custom-tailored suit and flashed a heavy gold watch every time he reached for his wine glass. My parents absolutely adored him. To them, Terrence was the wealthy, successful son they always wanted, the perfect match for their golden child, Madison. Dessert had just been cleared when my father Richard stood up and tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick legal binder. He slapped it down onto the center of the table with a loud thud that made the waiters jump. Since we are all gathered here for a milestone occasion, your mother and I decided it is the perfect time to finalize our living trust. My father announced, his chest puffed out with self-importance. We have officially transferred full ownership of the Belmont Plaza entirely to Madison and Terrence. The Belmont Plaza was the absolute crown jewel of my family's assets. It was a massive commercial complex right in the city, worth over $5 million, generating a massive monthly cash flow. Handing it over meant handing over the keys to generational wealth. I sat perfectly still, looking at the thick legal binder. My mother, Patricia, leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she noticed my complete lack of reaction. "Do not look so sour, Sydney," she scoffed, waving her manicured hand dismissively. "Terrence actually knows how to multiply wealth. He is a financial visionary. You are 33 years old, unmarried, and spending your days flipping foreclosed dumpsters in the muddy suburbs. We simply cannot trust the family legacy to a disappointment." Her words were specifically designed to draw blood. They always were. I opened my mouth to defend my career in commercial real estate redevelopment, but my father immediately cut me off. "Do not argue with your mother, Sydney. This is just basic economics. It is exactly like when I drained your college savings account to pay off Madison's massive credit card debt 10 years ago. In this country, you prioritize the child with the brightest future. You chose to be difficult and independent, so you get to survive on your own." Madison leaned her head against Terrence's shoulder and let out a high-pitched, mocking laugh. "Honestly, Sydney, you should be thanking us. Managing a $5 million commercial property requires actual business acumen. Terrence is managing millions in venture capital right now. You would probably accidentally sell the plaza for scrap metal just to pay your rent." Terrence chuckled, adjusting his expensive tie, basking in the glow of my parents' absolute worship. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and extreme arrogance, playing the role of the benevolent, wealthy savior perfectly. "Do not worry, Sid," Terrence said smoothly. "If you ever need a small personal loan to keep your little suburban projects afloat, my firm might be able to find some charity funds for you." My parents beamed at him as if he had just offered to cure a disease. The blatant disrespect was suffocating, but I maintained my composure. I knew exactly who I was, and I knew exactly what my so-called dumpsters were actually worth. Just then, the head waiter approached the table carrying a black leather check folder. He hesitated for a brief second, unsure who the host of the evening was. Madison immediately snapped her fingers loudly and pointed directly at me. The waiter awkwardly placed the folder in front of my plate. "Since you are not getting the estate," Madison smiled maliciously, showing all her teeth, "the absolute least you can do is cover dinner. Consider it back rent for all the years Mom and Dad put up with your difficult attitude." I looked down at the receipt inside the leather folder. The total was $4,200. My parents watched me closely, waiting for me to break down. They wanted me to cry. They wanted me to beg them for help. They wanted the deep satisfaction of watching the family scapegoat shatter in front of their golden child and her perfect husband. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not even frown. I calmly unclasped my purse. I did not give them the satisfaction of a single tear. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not beg. Instead, I calmly reached into my leather tote and pulled out a heavy matte black titanium card. The metallic clink it made as I dropped it onto the leather check folder was the loudest sound in the room. The head waiter, who had been hovering nervously near the edge of our table, instantly recognized the exclusive Centurion card. His posture straightened immediately, and his eyes widened in a mixture of deep respect and shock. He took the folder with both hands, bowing his head slightly, before rushing off to process the payment without a single question. My father leaned forward, squinting aggressively at the empty space on the table where the card had just been. The smug, triumphant satisfaction was wiped completely off his face, replaced rapidly by a deep, ugly shade of red. He shook his head, refusing to process what he had just seen. "What kind of game are you playing, Sydney?" Richard demanded, pointing a thick, accusing finger across the table. "You expect me to believe you qualified for a black card by flipping foreclosed suburban trash that has to be a fake? Or worse, you are committing corporate fraud with a company expense account." Patricia gasped loudly, pressing a manicured hand to her chest, as if physically scandalized by the very idea. "Sydney, if you are doing something illegal, do not expect your father to bail you out with his lawyers. We will not have the family name dragged through the mud because you wanted to pretend you belong in our tax bracket for one night." I kept my expression entirely blank, letting their panic wash over me. "There is no fraud, Mother, and it is certainly not a fake," Madison scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes and leaning heavier against Terrence's shoulder. "Please, you drive a practical sedan and live in a basic condo. Real wealth does not hide, Sydney. You probably bought a novelty metal card online just to show off tonight. It is honestly pathetic that you feel the need to try and impress us." The waiter returned before I could respond to my sister's delusions. He completely bypassed my father, stepping directly to my side with a silver pen and the printed receipt. He handed it to me with absolute reverence, a stark contrast to how my own flesh and blood treated me. I took the pen and looked directly into my father's eyes as I signed my name across the slip with a smooth, practiced motion. "You always were obsessed with the illusion of wealth rather than the actual mechanics of it," I said, my voice dangerously steady. I tore the customer copy from the binding and slid it slowly across the white linen tablecloth. It came to rest right against the base of my father's half-empty wine glass. "What is this?" he snapped, refusing to touch the small piece of paper. "That is reality," I replied, "just like when you emptied my college savings account to pay for Madison's sorority debts. Right, Dad? Do you remember that day I was 19 years old, working double shifts at the campus dining hall just to afford my own textbooks? I went to the bank to pay my tuition, only to find out you secretly transferred my entire educational fund to cover her maxed-out credit cards." Madison flushed bright red, glancing nervously at Terrence to gauge his reaction to this unfiltered piece of family history. "That was completely different," she stammered defensively, adjusting her designer necklace. "I had mandatory social obligations for networking. You were just taking basic classes at a state school." I ignored her completely, keeping my gaze locked on Richard. He looked away first. My father, the great patriarch, was completely unable to hold eye contact when confronted directly with his own historical financial abuse. "Consider this $4,200 my final severance package," I said, standing up and smoothing the front of my tailored suit. "You bought yourselves out of my life for the price of a fancy dinner. I want you to remember this moment because it is the cheapest transaction you will ever make with me." I picked up my purse and turned my back on them, walking toward the heavy oak doors of the private dining room. I could feel the sudden heavy vacuum of air in the room. The absolute shock of my defiance had paralyzed them. They were so used to me shrinking, apologizing, and trying desperately to earn their impossible approval, that my sudden cold detachment broke their entire predictable script. I had my hand firmly on the brass doorknob when Terrence's voice echoed behind me. His fragile ego simply could not handle being ignored. He needed the last word to prove he was still the dominant, successful man in the room. Hey, good luck with your little suburban houses, Sid. Terrence called out a loud, forced laugh following his words. Do not worry about the Belmont Plaza. Madison and I will send you a postcard from the yacht club once I double its valuation next quarter. I paused at the door. Slowly, I turned back around to face the table. Terrence was leaning back in his chair, swirling his wine, wearing a deeply patronizing smirk. My eyes dropped from his arrogant face to his left wrist. The heavy gold watch he loved to flash caught the ambient light from the crystal chandelier above. It was an expensive piece, easily $50,000, but to a trained eye, it was all surface flash, just like him. Good luck with the plaza, Terrence, I said, my tone completely devoid of emotion, cutting through his fake bravado. Commercial capitalization rates are brutal when you do not know how to read a basic balance sheet. His smirk instantly vanished. The dark red wine in his glass stopped swirling as his hand froze. What is that supposed to mean? Terrence snapped immediately, dropping his relaxed posture and sitting bolt upright, his defensive instincts flaring. It means real estate is not a flashy venture capital pitch deck, I replied, my voice slicing through the quiet room like a scalpel. You cannot charm a commercial mortgage underwriter. You actually have to generate legitimate revenue. I highly suggest you start learning the difference before the bank teaches it to you. I did not wait for his response or the inevitable excuses he would spin for my parents. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and walked out into the bustling main dining room. Behind me, the private room was dead silent. There were no more insults, no more mocking laughter, and no more arrogant boasts. I walked straight out of the restaurant and stepped into the crisp Chicago night air, leaving my family and their shiny new $5 million anchor completely behind. 3 years is a long time in the commercial real estate world. For my family, it was a 3-year-long victory lap at my expense. I never blocked Madison on social media. I deliberately kept my accounts active for the sole purpose of gathering intelligence. My feed became a daily high-definition broadcast of their unearned extravagance. Madison constantly tagged me in photos from Paris, sipping rare vintage champagne on private hotel balconies. She tagged me standing next to Terrence as he leaned against a slate-gray Aston Martin parked right in front of the Belmont Plaza. The captions were always passive-aggressive little daggers aimed directly at my throat. She wrote things like how blessed she was to have a husband who provides real wealth. She would post that some people just flip suburban houses while they build global empires. My mother, Patricia, preferred leaving voicemails. I would sit in my car and listen to her forced, sickly sweet tone dripping with immense condescension. She called me every major holiday just to make sure I knew exactly what I was missing. She would leave messages detailing how they were dining at the country club, bragging that Terrence just leveraged a portion of the plaza to seed a massive new tech startup fund. She loved to remind me how he was a genius with capital and how my father was so incredibly proud of the son he finally had. She always ended the calls by asking when I was going to give up my stubborn independent streak and ask Terrence for an entry-level job. I never answered a single call. I just archived the messages and went straight back to work. They truly believed I was drowning in suburban mud, struggling to make mortgage payments on a basic condo. They had absolutely no idea that while they were spending borrowed money, I was quietly buying up the city. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office. I was on the 40th floor of a sleek glass high-rise right in the heart of downtown Chicago's financial district. The city stretched out below me like a massive concrete chessboard. My desk was immaculate, dominated only by a blinking Bloomberg terminal and tall stacks of legal acquisitions. This was the headquarters of Apex Ventures. I built this private equity firm completely anonymously from the ground up. I did not flip residential houses. I acquired collapsed industrial parks, restructured massive logistics centers, and turned dead commercial zones into high-yield assets. In the real estate sector, Apex was known as a ruthless, aggressive buyer of distressed commercial debt. Nobody in the industry knew that a 33-year-old woman was the sole owner and managing partner. I kept my name entirely off the press releases and let my aggressive legal team handle all the public-facing negotiations. I preferred operating from the shadows, It made the execution much cleaner. The heavy glass door to my office swung open. Mitchell stepped inside. He was a 50-year-old corporate attorney with a reputation for ripping apart commercial leases and bankrupting bad actors. He did not bother with a polite greeting. He walked straight to my desk and dropped a thick red folder right on top of my keyboard. The label on the tab read Terrence Holdings, LLC. I looked up at him, crossing my arms over my tailored blazer. I told him I hoped he had found the bottom of the well. Mitchell unbuttoned his suit jacket and sat heavily in the chair opposite my desk. He told me there was no well, but rather a massive sinkhole. He opened the folder and slid a series of highlighted bank statements toward me. He explained that my brother-in-law was not a venture capitalist. Terrence did not own a portfolio of tech startups. He was running a highly sophisticated, incredibly reckless Ponzi scheme. He had been taking investor capital, promising guaranteed 20% returns, and using the new money to pay off the old investors. The rest of the cash went directly to funding his Aston Martin and my sister's relentless European shopping sprees. I traced my finger over the staggering negative balances printed on the page. I asked Mitchell about the Belmont Plaza, the exact asset my parents had gifted him 3 years ago. Mitchell let out a dry, humorless laugh. He explained that Terrence used the family property as his personal ATM. He stripped all the cash flow from the commercial tenants to prop up his fake venture fund. Terrence neglected the basic property maintenance, drove out the reliable anchor tenants, and completely tanked the net operating income. To cover his tracks and keep the illusion alive, he took out a massive high-yield commercial loan against the plaza's remaining equity. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted loan documents Mitchell had managed to acquire through his back-channel network. The interest rates Terrence had agreed to were absolutely predatory. It was the financial equivalent of a death spiral. I looked back up at my attorney and asked when the music was going to stop. Mitchell tapped a manicured fingernail against the heavy red folder. He stated that the music stopped on Tuesday. Terrence had officially defaulted on the $3.5 million commercial loan. He missed his final cure period yesterday. The originating bank was quietly auctioning off the distressed debt this Friday morning. They wanted the toxic asset off their books before the quarter ended. Terrence was desperately trying to find a bridge lender to bail him out, but his credit was completely destroyed. No legitimate financial institution would touch him. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. For 3 years, I had listened to my family praise the man who was actively destroying their entire legacy. I listened to them belittle my hard work while they coasted on stolen funds. The universe was finally handing me the exact weapon I needed. I closed the red folder and slid it back across the desk toward Mitchell. I told him to call the bank immediately. I did not want to negotiate, and I did not want a bidding war. I ordered him to buy the debt through Apex Ventures, pay whatever premium the bank wanted to close the deal by tomorrow afternoon, and buy it all. The invitation came exactly 2 weeks after my lawyer secured the debt. I was sitting at my kitchen island reviewing the final transfer documents that made Apex Ventures the sole owner of the Belmont Plaza mortgage, when my phone lit up with my mother's caller ID. I almost did not answer. Patricia never called me unless she needed a scapegoat or a physical punching bag to make herself feel superior. This time, however, her voice dripped with a manufactured honey so thick it made my stomach turn. She told me the holidays were about forgiveness, and that the family simply could not imagine sitting down for Thanksgiving dinner without me. I knew instantly it was a trap. People who spend 33 years telling you that you do not belong do not suddenly discover the magic of family unity over roasted turkey. They only reach out when they have exhausted every single other option. I accepted the invitation without hesitation because I needed a front row seat to their desperation. I needed to see what men like Terrence looked like when the walls finally started closing in. When I pulled into the circular driveway of my parents' sprawling North Shore mansion on Thanksgiving afternoon, the first thing I noticed was the glaring, empty space. Terrence's slate gray Aston Martin was completely gone. In its place sat a modest domestic rental car. I stepped inside the heavy mahogany doors, and the tension in the house hit me like a physical wall. The usual holiday jazz music was playing, and the scent of expensive catering filled the air, but the atmosphere was absolutely suffocating. Madison was pacing the grand foyer, chewing aggressively on her thumbnail, her designer dress looking slightly wrinkled and unkempt. When Terrence finally emerged from the formal living room, I almost did not recognize him. The smooth, arrogant venture capitalist from the Michelin-starred dinner had completely vanished. He had lost at least 15 pounds. His eyes were severely bloodshot, darting around the room with the frantic, terrified energy of a hunted animal. His custom-tailored suit hung loosely on his thinning frame, and he was sweating profusely despite the cool November air conditioning circulating through the mansion. He refused to make eye contact with me, keeping his gaze firmly planted on the hardwood floor. We moved to the formal dining room. The long table was laden with silver platters and crystal glasses, yet no one seemed to have an appetite. Patricia kept forcing tight, unnatural smiles and offering me more wine, pouring it with hands that visibly shook. The hollow small talk lasted exactly 14 minutes before my father decided to drop the charade. Richard dropped his heavy silverware onto his china plate with a loud clatter and leaned forward, bracing his elbows rigidly on the table. He did not ask how my career was going. He did not ask about my life or my health. He locked his eyes on mine and completely changed the subject with the aggressive entitlement he always used to control the room. He stated that family requires sacrifice, and right now the family was facing a temporary cash flow hiccup. He purposely used the word hiccup, trying to minimize the absolute financial ruin staring them directly in the face. Richard looked at me with cold, demanding authority. He told me that I lived a very frugal, quiet life in a modest condominium. He pointed out that I had no husband and no children to support, implying that my money was essentially useless sitting in a bank account. Then he delivered the true purpose of this Thanksgiving ambush. He demanded that I go to the bank on Monday morning and take out a $500,000 personal loan against the equity in my home. He needed me to hand that cash directly to Terrence to stabilize his venture fund and save my sister's lifestyle. I set my wine glass down very slowly. I looked around the table. 4 adults were staring at me, genuinely expecting me to mortgage my only visible asset to blindly bail out a man who had publicly humiliated me just 3 years prior. I looked directly at Terrence and asked my father why a financial genius with millions in venture capital could not simply secure his own commercial bridge loan. Terrence swallowed hard, frantically wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead with a linen napkin, but he remained completely silent. It was Madison who erupted. She slammed her perfectly manicured fist onto the dining table, making the expensive silverware rattle violently against the plates. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, entitled rage. She screamed that I owed them this money. She shouted that the family had supported my useless, independent existence for years, and that I had absolutely zero gratitude for everything they had sacrificed for me. To prove her point, she wildly claimed that she was the only reason I ever had anything, loudly reminding everyone that she had given me her old car for free when I was completely broke just out of college. The sheer audacity of her rewriting our family history was stunning. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her hysterical energy. I picked up my wine glass by the thin crystal stem, took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark red Cabernet, and let the heavy silence stretch until the room felt like it was running out of oxygen. I looked directly into my sister's furious, panicked eyes. I told her she did not give me a car. I reminded her that she drove that vehicle straight into a brick retaining wall at 2 in the morning because she was blackout drunk after a sorority party. I reminded her that our father dragged me out of bed, forced me to drive to the scene of the accident before the police arrived, and made me tell the responding officers that I was the one behind the wheel, so her pristine record would stay perfectly clean. Madison's jaw snapped shut. The heavy crystal wine glass in her hand trembled violently, spilling a few drops of dark red Cabernet onto the pristine white tablecloth. She shot a panicked, wide-eyed look at Terrence, who was suddenly staring at her with genuine shock. He clearly had no idea his perfect, polished wife possessed a criminal record that had been quietly erased by her older sister's forced sacrifice. For a fraction of a second, the carefully constructed facade of the golden couple cracked wide open, but Richard did not miss a beat. My father possessed a terrifying ability to rewrite reality in real time. He slammed his thick fist down exactly where Madison had, rattling the fine china and crystal across the entire length of the Thanksgiving table. He immediately redirected the narrative, employing the exact gaslighting tactics he had used to control me since childhood. He yelled that I was living in the past, deliberately holding on to ancient fabricated resentments because I was deeply jealous of Madison's flawless marriage and elevated social standing. He claimed my memory of the accident was completely distorted by my own bitter insecurities and my chronic inability to succeed on my own. Patricia immediately joined the assault, functioning flawlessly as my father's loyal attack dog. Her voice rose to a shrill, hysterical pitch that echoed off the vaulted ceiling of the formal dining room. She pointed her manicured finger at me from across the table, her face flushed with hot indignation. She screeched that I was the most selfish, ungrateful daughter a mother could ever bear to raise. She rapidly listed my supposed crimes, stating that I maliciously hoarded my meager condo equity, while my own flesh and blood faced a minor liquidity issue. She accused me of trying to sabotage my sister's happiness out of pure, unadulterated spite. $500,000 is absolutely nothing, Sydney, Patricia screamed, clutching her linen napkin so tightly her knuckles turned stark white. It is a microscopic drop in the bucket compared to what Terrence manages daily. You are talking about pocket change to save the family empire. Terrence is on the verge of closing a massive series of tech acquisitions that will double our net worth overnight. He just needs a tiny bridge loan for a few weeks to clear the banking red tape. You are deliberately trying to ruin your sister's future because you are miserable and alone. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their delusion. They had wrapped themselves in a protective cocoon of lies, completely insulated from the financial reality crashing down around their ears. Terrence sat frozen at the end of the table, his skin glistening with cold, terrified sweat. He was praying I would just shut up, submit to the family pressure, write the check, and keep his fragile house of cards standing for one more month. He looked at me with pathetic, silent desperation, silently begging me to play along with the charade. I did not play along. I placed my linen napkin neatly beside my plate, ensuring the edges were perfectly aligned. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, and stood up to my full height. I looked down at the four of them, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, clinical detachment. The years of seeking their validation had completely evaporated, leaving only a sharp tactical focus. You think $500,000 will save you? I asked, my voice deadly calm and slicing entirely through Patricia's lingering hysteria. I turned my gaze entirely to my brother-in-law. He shrank back into his heavy dining chair, as if I had just drawn a weapon on him. His eyes darted toward the exit, looking for an escape route that did not exist. Terrence, why do you not tell my father about the notice of default you received on Tuesday morning? The room went dead silent. The ambient jazz music playing from the hidden ceiling speakers suddenly seemed deafening. The only other sound was the hum of the central heating pushing warm air through the brass floor vents. Madison stopped breathing. Patricia slowly lowered her pointing finger. Tell him, I commanded, my voice taking on an authoritative edge that demanded absolute compliance. Tell him that you are $3.5 million in arrears. Tell him that you drained every single cent of equity from the Belmont Plaza to illegally fund your fake venture capital firm. Tell your father-in-law that the crown jewel of his family portfolio officially goes into public foreclosure in exactly 7 days. My father's head snapped toward Terrence so fast it looked physically painful. The aggressive red flush completely drained from Richard's face, leaving him a sickly ghost white. The absolute certainty of his wealthy patriarch persona shattered instantly. He lunged across the corner of the dining table, knocking over a heavy crystal water pitcher. The ice water spilled over the roasted turkey and soaked into the tablecloth, but Richard did not care. He grabbed Terrence violently by the collar of his expensive custom dress shirt. What is she talking about, Terrence? Richard roared, physically shaking the younger man in his chair. What default? What foreclosure? Terrence stammered uncontrollably, his hands flying up in a defensive panic to pry Richard's thick fingers off his neck. He babbled that it was all a terrible mistake, a predatory banking setup designed to ruin his flawless reputation. He cried out that a ruthless anonymous hedge fund had suddenly bought up his commercial debt from the original lending bank. He claimed this shadow company was acting in bad faith, illegally accelerating the foreclosure timeline to steal the asset out from under him before he could secure fresh capital from his overseas investors. He swore to Richard that he just needed the $500,000 today to hire an aggressive corporate litigation team to stop the auction and save the plaza. I calmly picked up my tailored wool coat from the back of my dining chair and draped it gracefully over my forearm. I looked at the pathetic, chaotic scene unfolding before me. My father was physically assaulting his chosen golden boy. My mother was hyperventilating into her hands, and my sister was staring blankly at the ruined Thanksgiving dinner, her mouth hanging slightly open. "Sounds like you have bigger problems than my condo," I said. The cold Chicago air whipped through the parking lot, biting at my exposed skin, but I hardly felt it. My pace remained measured and rhythmic, each step echoing on the wet asphalt. I could hear Terrence behind me, his expensive leather soles clicking rapidly against the pavement. He was frantic, stumbling slightly, his breath coming in jagged, uneven gasps. He was the type of man who thrived on being the smartest person in the room, and the realization that he had been outplayed by the sister-in-law he considered a social failure was clearly shredding his remaining sanity. He caught up to me just as I reached my sedan. I didn't turn around until I felt him lunge toward my shoulder. I spun instantly, sidestepping his clumsy grasp with a grace that only made his lack of composure more apparent. I stared at him, my expression a mask of chilling neutrality. He looked pathetic. The sharp, tailored edges of his personality had completely eroded, leaving behind a frantic, cornered animal. "You think you are so clever, do you not?" he hissed. He looked around the dimly lit parking lot, scanning for witnesses, but we were alone under the harsh glare of a single flickering streetlight. He leaned into my space, his smell a mixture of expensive cologne and fear. "You think you can walk into that dinner, drop a few figures you probably stole from a glorified administrative clerk, and actually scare me? I know exactly how you operate, Sydney. You have always been green with envy. You are nothing but a bitter, lonely spinster festering in that hollow life of yours, watching from the sidelines while Madison and I actually live." I let him continue. I didn't interrupt. I just watched him unravel. "If you breathe one single word of this to anyone else in the industry, I will destroy you," he continued, his voice rising in volume. "I have lawyers who make your entire life look like a footnote. I have concrete evidence of how you obtained this data. You hacked my private servers, did you not? You broke into my secure network to steal confidential trade secrets. I am going to have you prosecuted for corporate espionage, Sydney. You will be lucky if you do not spend the next decade in federal prison for this little stunt." I didn't flinch. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen was dark, but the red recording light was glowing steadily. I kept it in my hand, visible enough that he couldn't miss it. "You seem remarkably confused about the timeline of events, Terrence," I said, my voice cutting through his vitriol like a blade. "I do not need to hack you. You are not worth the bandwidth required to bypass your firewall. I just read the public foreclosure filings. They are clearly indexed and summarized in Duyen Mao 1_11.docx. He stared at the phone in my hand, his face draining of color. He reached out to grab it, but I pulled it back with a sharp movement. "Do not even think about it," I warned. "My security systems are tied to the cloud. You are not just dealing with the foreclosure filings. I have a complete breakdown of your firm's internal audit in Duyen Mao 2_11.docx. It is quite fascinating reading. The bank correspondence regarding your default, the one you said was a banking error, is right here in Duyen Mao 3_11.docx. And if you are really feeling nostalgic, I have the full ledger documenting the Ponzi scheme you are running right here in Duyen Mao 4_11.docx. His eyes darted from my face to the phone, and for a second, he looked like he might faint. The color had completely abandoned his skin, leaving him looking sickly and gray. He knew I had him. There was no way to spin this. There was no charm left to deploy. "You cannot do this," he stammered, his voice finally cracking. "We are family. I was just trying to grow the business. I was trying to provide for Madison." I ignored his pleas. They were as transparent and useless as the rest of his life. I grabbed the handle of my car door and pulled it open, the interior light casting a soft glow on the pavement. I looked at him one last time, watching the reality of his future finally settle into his panicked eyes. He wasn't just losing a house. He was losing his identity, his freedom, and the fake life he had curated for my sister. "Sounds like you have bigger problems than my condo, Terrence," I said. I started the engine, the low hum of the luxury car drowning out his whimpering protests. I didn't look in the rearview mirror as I pulled out of the parking lot. I didn't care to watch him stand there alone in the dark, finally faced with the consequences of being the man he had always pretended to be. I had an auction to win on Friday, and I had a front row seat to the collapse of the only empire that had ever truly mattered to my parents. It was going to be the best weekend of my life. The morning sunlight sliced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, illuminating the polished mahogany desk and the panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. It was Friday morning, the day after the Thanksgiving massacre. I was seated in my ergonomic leather chair, sipping a black espresso, while Mitchell, my lead acquisitions attorney, sat across from me. He was reviewing the final foreclosure auction documents for the Belmont Plaza. The atmosphere in the headquarters of Apex Ventures was crisp, efficient, and ruthlessly calm, a stark contrast to the hysterical wreckage I had left behind in my parents' driveway the night before. The sleek corporate phone on my desk began to vibrate, the caller ID flashing in bright white letters. Richard. I did not reach for the receiver immediately. I let it ring 3 times, allowing the tension to build before I pressed the speakerphone button. I knew exactly what was coming. A normal father might have called to apologize for physically assaulting his son-in-law, or for demanding his daughter mortgage her home to fund a criminal enterprise. Richard, however, was incapable of self-reflection. He only knew how to attack when his authority was threatened. His voice boomed through the speaker, harsh and completely devoid of warmth. He did not say good morning. He did not ask if I had made it home safely. He immediately launched into a vicious, full-scale verbal assault. He demanded to know what was wrong with my brain. He shouted that I had maliciously ruined the holiday, deliberately waiting until everyone was vulnerable to drop my fabricated, hysterical accusations. According to my father, my sister had spent the entire night weeping hysterically and currently required mild sedatives just to cope with the trauma of my jealousy. I leaned back in my chair and caught Mitchell's eye. Mitchell raised a single amused eyebrow, his pen pausing over the foreclosure paperwork. Richard's voice escalated, vibrating with absolute misplaced self-righteousness. He completely dismissed the cold, hard facts I had presented. He told me that he had sat down with Terrence in his study until 3 in the morning, and they had ironed everything out. Terrence had apparently spun a masterful tale, convincing my father that the $3.5 million default was nothing more than an aggressive banking strategy. "You never understood high finance, Sydney," Richard sneered through the speaker, his tone dripping with the exact same condescension he used when I was 18, and he refused to co-sign a small student loan for my business degree. "You have a tiny pedestrian mind suited for balancing checkbooks in a cubicle. Terrence is a visionary. Visionaries take risks. You cannot possibly comprehend the complexities of commercial real estate or corporate leverage. Terrence simply utilized the plaza's equity to secure a much larger international acquisition. It is a temporary restructuring, not a failure." The sheer magnitude of his delusion was almost impressive. My father was a man who had built a respectable manufacturing business in the 80s, but his desperate need to be seen as a modern financial titan made him an incredibly easy mark for a smooth-talking con artist like Terrence. Richard was willfully choosing to believe a man who was actively robbing him blind simply because acknowledging the truth would mean admitting his golden son-in-law was a fraud, and by extension that his own judgment was fatally flawed. I took a slow sip of my espresso, letting his insults hang in the quiet air of my office. I asked him if a temporary restructuring usually involved a shadow ledger, federal wire fraud, and an imminent public auction. My father practically spat into the receiver. He yelled that the auction was a farce, an illegal pressure tactic deployed by a rogue bottom-feeding hedge fund that had somehow acquired the debt through a clerical error. He was absolutely vibrating with arrogance, now puffing his chest out from 20 miles away. He declared that he was stepping in to handle the situation personally, taking the reins to protect his family's assets from these anonymous predators. He boasted that these aggressive little firms thought they could bully their way into the big leagues, but they had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. He loudly reminded me that he had spent 40 years building a formidable empire. He was going to leverage his old Chicago business connections to freeze the foreclosure, tie the hedge fund up in endless bureaucratic litigation, and force them to sell the debt back to Terrence for pennies on the dollar. He sounded entirely convinced of his own invincibility. "This Apex Ventures is a joke," Richard scoffed, the disdain thick in his throat. They are hiding behind shell companies and proxy lawyers because they are cowards. But they made a fatal mistake targeting my family. I had my legal team file an injunction at dawn. We forced their hand. I have a meeting with the CEO of Apex Ventures on Monday morning. I will look this coward in the eye and I will crush them in the boardroom. They will be begging to settle by noon. The silence that followed his grand declaration was absolute. The office felt perfectly still. The sunlight reflected off the glass awards lined up on the shelf behind me, awards celebrating Apex Ventures as one of the most aggressive and successful distressed asset acquisition firms in the Midwest. I looked across the polished mahogany desk at Mitchell. He had stopped reviewing the paperwork entirely. He was leaning back in his chair, a slow, razor-sharp smile spreading across his face as he looked at the speakerphone. He tapped his pen twice against the foreclosure deed, a silent applause for my father's spectacular hubris. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk, bringing my face closer to the microphone. My voice was perfectly smooth, betraying zero emotion, carrying the quiet, lethal weight of absolute authority. I'm sure the CEO of Apex is looking forward to crushing you too. The Monday morning sun glared off the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the Apex Ventures executive boardroom. The room was explicitly designed to intimidate. It was a masterpiece of cold, modern architecture, featuring a massive slab of polished black marble for a conference table and 12 ergonomic leather chairs. There was no artwork on the walls, only glowing digital displays tracking global market shifts and real-time acquisition data. It was not a room meant for friendly negotiation. It was a room built for execution. Richard paced the length of the marble table, his heavy footsteps echoing sharply against the glass. He was wearing his best power suit, a dark navy ensemble that he likely thought projected absolute authority, but the tailoring could not hide the frantic, nervous energy rolling off him in waves. Patricia and Madison sat rigidly in their chairs, clutching their designer handbags in their laps, like protective shields. They were trying desperately to project the image of generational wealth and untouchable elite status, but the dark circles under Madison's eyes and the tight pinched lines around Patricia's mouth betrayed a weekend of absolute terror. Terrence sat at the far end of the table looking physically ill. His skin was a pallid, clammy gray and he was sweating profusely through his expensive dress shirt. He kept checking his watch, his knee bouncing up and down under the table in a manic, uncontrollable rhythm. He had spent the last 48 hours trapped in a living nightmare, fully aware that I possessed the exact ledgers proving his venture capital firm was nothing but a hollow Ponzi scheme. He had clearly not told my father the extent of my knowledge or the reality of our parking lot confrontation. Terrence had opted instead to let Richard march blindly into the slaughterhouse, hoping a miracle would save him. Richard stopped pacing and jabbed his thick finger at the sleek intercom speaker resting in the center of the table. He pressed the button with unnecessary aggressive force. He barked at the executive assistant outside, demanding to know why the CEO of Apex Ventures was keeping him waiting for 14 minutes. He shouted that his time was worth more than this entire building and that he had half a mind to pull his legal team off their leashes right this second. The assistant's voice responded with practiced robotic politeness, assuring him that the CEO would be with them shortly. This completely enraged my father. He began pacing again loudly, boasting to the empty room, ensuring his voice carried through the glass walls to the busy analysts working in the bullpen outside. He proclaimed that he had Chicago politicians on speed dial. He bragged about his ruthless corporate attorneys who would tie this amateur hedge fund up in federal court for a decade if they did not immediately release the Belmont Plaza deed. He loudly reassured Madison that this whole ordeal was nothing but a minor bureaucratic misstep orchestrated by low-level paper pushers who simply did not understand how high finance worked. He promised his golden daughter that he was going to walk out of this building with a signed release form and a formal groveling apology from whoever was foolish enough to run this firm. Patricia chimed in loudly, complaining about the absolute lack of hospitality. She noted with immense disdain that a proper firm would have offered them sparkling water or fresh espresso by now. She sneered that Apex Ventures clearly lacked class and basic corporate etiquette, proving they were nothing but bottom-feeding scavengers. Madison sat entirely mute, her eyes darting toward the heavy oak doors every time she heard a footstep in the hallway. She looked exactly like a woman bracing for a catastrophic car crash. At exactly 9:15, the heavy oak doors at the front of the boardroom finally clicked open. The sound was sharp and definitive, instantly silencing my father's arrogant monologue. Richard squared his shoulders, puffing out his chest, and arranging his features into a mask of pure, domineering rage. He was ready to scream. He was ready to threaten. Mitchell walked in first. My lead acquisitions attorney moved with the relaxed, lethal confidence of a man who had won the war before the first shot was even fired. He carried a thick stack of heavy manila folders, dropping them onto the center of the black marble table with a loud, resounding thud. He did not offer a greeting. He did not introduce himself. He simply pulled out the chair at the head of the table, stepped to the side, and stood waiting with his hands clasped behind his back. Richard opened his mouth, his face turning an aggressive shade of purple as he prepared to unleash his practiced tirade upon Mitchell, but the words completely died in his throat. I stepped through the oak doors. I was wearing a bespoke charcoal gray wool suit tailored specifically for me in Milan, paired with a crisp white silk blouse and stilettos that echoed with sharp authority on the hardwood floor. I looked exactly like what I was, a woman in absolute control of a multi-million-dollar financial empire. The oxygen instantly vanished from the boardroom. Patricia let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp, her manicured hand flying up to cover her mouth. Madison pushed herself back into her leather chair, her eyes wide with unadulterated shock. Terrence simply lowered his head, burying his sweating face into his hands as a low, pathetic groan escaped his lips. Richard stood frozen in the middle of the room. His mouth hung open. His eyes darted from Mitchell to the stack of files, and finally to me, completely unable to process the reality standing right in front of him. I paused just inside the threshold. I let my eyes slowly sweep across the room, taking in every single detail of their stunned, paralyzed horror. I reached behind me, grasped the brass handle of the heavy oak door, and pushed it shut. A loud metallic click echoed through the silent boardroom as I locked the door from the inside. The sharp metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the cavernous boardroom like a gunshot. For 3 agonizing seconds, nobody dared to breathe. The air in the room grew suffocatingly thick as my family's brains scrambled to process the image of me standing before them. I was not the obedient scapegoat they expected. I was not the frugal, lonely spinster they mocked at Thanksgiving dinner. I was standing in their arena wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than my father's entire holiday catering budget, radiating absolute, undeniable authority. It was Patricia who broke the deafening silence. Her mind was utterly incapable of reconciling my commanding presence with the sheer wealth of my environment. Rather than accept the reality unfolding right in front of her, she aggressively defaulted to the only language she knew. She pushed her chair back so violently it slammed against the glass wall behind her. She shot to her feet, thrusting a manicured finger in my direction. Her face twisted into a grotesque mask of aristocratic indignation, her cheeks flushed with hot, unearned entitlement. "What are you doing here, Sydney?" Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the polished marble table. "Are you an assistant here? Get out before the CEO arrives and you embarrass us." Terrence let out a pathetic, strangled whimper. He reached across the table with a trembling, clammy hand and desperately yanked on the sleeve of Patricia's designer blouse, trying to pull her back down into her seat. He knew exactly what was happening. He had seen the foreclosure filings on my phone in the dark parking lot. He had seen the proof of his Ponzi scheme. But Patricia completely ignored him, violently shaking off his grip. She continued to glare at me, waiting for me to lower my head, apologize for my intrusion, and scurry out the door like a reprimanded child. I did not move a single muscle. I simply stared back at her with eyes as cold and unforgiving as the black marble table separating us. Mitchell did not even bother to look at my mother. He simply straightened his tailored suit jacket, picked up the thickest file from his stack, and cleared his throat. The sound was sharp, professional, and commanded absolute attention, forcing Patricia to snap her mouth shut in sheer surprise. "Mr. and Mrs. Williams." Mitchell began, his voice perfectly smooth and dangerously polite. "Please take your seats. Allow me to introduce the founder and sole managing partner of Apex Ventures, Ms. Sydney Williams. She owns your debt." The words hung in the air, heavy and lethal. Richard literally fell back into his chair. It was as if Mitchell had taken a sledgehammer to the back of his knees. The breath rushed out of his lungs in a harsh, ragged gasp that sounded like a physical tear in his chest. He gripped the armrests of his leather chair so tightly, his knuckles turned a translucent white. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, watching his entire legacy, his ego and his patriarchal power crumble into absolute dust. This was the man who had just spent 20 minutes loudly bragging to an empty room about his untouchable Chicago business connections. This was the man who had promised to ruin the anonymous hedge fund targeting his family. And now the apex predator he had sworn to destroy was his own daughter. Next to him, Madison started hyperventilating. The golden child facade shattered into a million jagged pieces. Her chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths, her perfectly styled hair trembling as she clutched her expensive handbag to her chest like a useless shield. She looked at Terrence for salvation, but Terrence was entirely catatonic. He kept his gaze fixed on the polished floor, entirely broken by the magnitude of his own fraudulent failures. The reality of their situation had finally breached their protective bubble of denial. They were completely bankrupt, facing federal wire fraud, and their only lifeline was the sister they had spent a lifetime abusing. I took a slow, deliberate breath, savoring the absolute shift in power. I walked toward the head of the table. Every step of my stilettos against the hardwood floor sounded like a countdown clock ticking down to their financial execution. I moved with a predatory grace, bypassing my mother, who had finally slumped back into her chair, in a state of mute, paralyzed shock. I stopped directly across from my father. He looked incredibly small. The booming, arrogant patriarch from the Thanksgiving table had completely vanished, replaced by a terrified aging man staring down the barrel of total ruin. I reached out and took the top file from Mitchell. I opened it with slow, deliberate precision. I pulled out the original notarized $3.5 million promissory note. It was the exact document Terrence had signed, pledging the Belmont Plaza as collateral for his reckless illegal venture fund. I held the heavy parchment paper between my fingers for a brief second, ensuring Richard could clearly see Terrence's signature at the bottom of the page. Then with a flick of my wrist, I tossed the document onto the black marble. It slid smoothly across the polished surface, coming to a dead stop directly in front of my father's shaking hands. I leaned forward, planting both of my palms firmly on the table. I locked my eyes directly onto Richard's terrified, bloodshot gaze, refusing to let him look away from the empire I had built and the destruction I now controlled. "Please, Dad," I said, my voice dripping with cold, calculated anticipation. "Proceed with how you are going to crush me." Richard's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The great patriarch was rendered entirely mute by the sheer weight of his own hubris crashing down upon him. He looked at the promissory note bearing Terrence's signature, then at me, his face devoid of its usual tyrannical color. The silence stretched thick and suffocating as the power dynamic in the room permanently inverted. Patricia, however, possessed a survival instinct honed by decades of country club warfare and relentless social climbing. The absolute horror on her face melted away, replaced in a fraction of a second by a radiant, synthetic smile. It was a terrifying, unnatural transformation. She smoothed her designer skirt, stood up, and clasped her hands together in a gesture of overwhelming manufactured maternal pride. She completely ignored the mounting evidence of our actual relationship and dove straight into total delusion. "Oh, Sydney," Patricia gasped, her voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet syrup that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "My brilliant, brilliant daughter." She walked around her chair, stepping toward the table with her arms open wide as if preparing to embrace me across the cold expanse of the black marble. "I knew it. I told your father just this morning. I said Richard Sidney is too smart to let those anonymous corporate sharks tear our family apart. You bought our debt to save us. You are keeping the plaza in the family." She turned to look at Madison, her eyes wide with frantic, forced joy, demanding her golden child play along. "Do you see, Madison? Your sister is an absolute genius. She used her little firm to swoop in and rescue Terrence from that awful hedge fund. It was a rescue mission all along. She was working behind the scenes to protect us." Patricia looked back at me, her smile stretched so incredibly tight, it looked physically painful. "We are so incredibly proud of you, darling. You have finally stepped up to protect the Williams legacy. Now, why do you not have your assistant tear up that nasty paperwork so we can all go celebrate over a proper lunch? We can put all this silly unpleasantness behind us. The sheer magnitude of her delusion was staggering. She was attempting to rewrite reality in real time, desperate to cast me not as their conqueror, but as their obedient, subservient savior. She expected me to eagerly accept this sudden, highly conditional approval. She expected me to hand over a multi-million-dollar asset just to earn the maternal validation I had stopped seeking a decade ago. I did not flinch. I did not return her smile. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, my hands resting lightly on the polished table. "I did not buy it to save you, Mother," I stated. My voice was completely flat, entirely devoid of the emotional validation she was desperately fishing for. Patricia's synthetic smile faltered, dropping a fraction of an inch, revealing the raw panic underneath. "Do not be silly, Sydney. Of course you did. You are family. I am the founder and managing partner of a distressed asset acquisition firm." I corrected her, my tone clinical, precise, and unyielding. "I purchased your debt because it was a highly profitable distressed asset. I bought it at a 40% discount." I shifted my cold gaze to Terence, who visibly shrank back into his chair, trying to make himself as small as possible as my eyes locked onto him. "I secured that steep discount." I continued, making sure every single syllable echoed clearly in the silent room, "because your golden son-in-law systematically trashed the property's net operating income. Terrence bloated the payroll with ghost consultants, ignored critical structural maintenance, and siphoned the rental yields to cover the margins on his failing illegal venture capital fund. The Belmont Plaza is currently bleeding cash. To the open market, it is a toxic liability. To me, it is a prime restructuring opportunity." I turned my attention back to my mother, whose face had gone chalk white, the artificial flush completely drained. "There is no rescue mission. There is no family discount. I am foreclosing on the property this Friday at noon, and I am officially evicting Terrence's management company from the commercial deed. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises." The words struck the table with the devastating force of a physical blow. Patricia sank slowly back into her leather chair, all the artificial sweetness draining from her features, leaving behind nothing but cold, naked terror. The reality of the eviction finally shattered the last remnants of Richard's shock. The temporary paralysis broke, replaced instantly by the explosive, volatile rage he always deployed when he was backed into a corner and stripped of his control. "You ungrateful little viper!" Richard roared. He slammed both of his heavy fists onto the black marble table with a violent force that made the digital displays on the walls vibrate. "You cannot do this. You will not do this. We are your family. We are your flesh and blood." He leaned heavily over the table, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger directly at my face, his voice rising to a frantic, booming shout that filled the cavernous room. "I gave you life. I put a roof over your head. I paid for the very clothes on your back growing up. You owe me absolute loyalty. You do not get to walk in here wearing a fancy suit and steal my property. I will drag you through every court in this state. I will publicly ruin you. I will make sure everyone in Chicago knows exactly what kind of treacherous, backstabbing daughter you really are." His face was a dangerous mottled crimson, a thick vein pulsing erratically in his neck. He was entirely unhinged, clinging desperately to the patriarchal authority that I had just legally dismantled. He truly, genuinely believed he could scream his way out of a federal foreclosure. He believed his sheer volume could override a legally binding contract. I watched his tantrum with absolute clinical detachment. I did not raise my voice to match his. I did not defend myself against his baseless accusations. I simply let him exhaust the air in his lungs. When he finally paused to suck in a ragged, desperate breath, I turned my head slightly to look at Mitchell. I gave my lead attorney a single subtle nod. Mitchell reached into his sleek leather briefcase resting on the floor beside his chair. He pulled out a second folder. This one was not standard manila. It was thick, heavy, and colored a deep warning red. Mitchell placed it securely in my waiting hand. I placed my palm flat on top of the red folder. I looked directly at my father, watching the angry, vibrant color slowly begin to drain from his face as his eyes locked onto the new document. The room fell deathly silent once again, the only sound the ragged breathing of my terrified family. I slid the thick red folder across the smooth marble surface. It glided effortlessly, coming to a dead stop, right next to the $3.5 million promissory note directly in front of Richard's clenched fists. "That is not even the worst part," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal register. "Open the folder, Dad. Look at page 4. Richard's hands hovered over the heavy red folder. The arrogant patriarch who had marched into my boardroom just minutes ago, threatening federal lawsuits and boasting of his political connections, was completely gone. He slowly flipped the thick cover open, the stiff paper, making a harsh scraping sound against the polished black marble table. He turned to page 4, just as I had instructed. I watched his eyes scan the dense block of legal text highlighted in the center of the page. It took him exactly 5 seconds to comprehend what he was looking at. The transformation was absolute and devastating. The remaining angry color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His hands began to shake, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that rattled the heavy parchment against the table. He could not tear his eyes away from the document. He looked exactly like a man staring directly into his own open grave. Patricia sensed the massive shift in the atmosphere immediately. The synthetic, desperate smile she had plastered on her face completely dissolved, replaced by a tight mask of dawning panic. She leaned toward her husband, her voice dropping to a frantic, breathy whisper. She demanded to know what it was. She asked him what the paper said, her manicured fingernails digging ruthlessly into the sleeve of his expensive navy suit. Richard did not answer her. He could not. His jaw worked silently, trying to form words that his brain absolutely refused to process. He simply sat there, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal staring back at him in bold black ink. I did not leave them in suspense. I broke the agonizing silence with a voice that was perfectly calm, carrying the icy precision of a surgeon making a final incision. I explained the reality of the situation to my mother, ensuring every single word echoed clearly across the quiet boardroom. I told her that Terrence could not secure a $3.5 million commercial loan based solely on the Belmont Plaza's valuation. I laid out the financial facts plainly. Terrence's personal credit was absolute garbage. He was heavily leveraged, overextended, and drowning in unseen liabilities from his previous failed ventures. No legitimate financial institution would ever hand him that kind of capital without a massive ironclad safety net. To get the money to fund his phantom tech acquisitions, he needed a guarantee that outweighed the severe risk of his own incompetence. I watched Madison's eyes widen as she began to connect the dots, her gaze darting frantically between me and her sweating husband. I continued detailing the exact mechanism of their ruin. I explained that Terrence used a cross-collateralization clause. It was a standard, utterly ruthless lending tactic designed to link multiple assets to a single high-risk debt. He had buried the clause deep within the hundreds of pages of legalese he brought to Richard's study during those late-night whiskey-soaked strategy sessions. Terrence knew Richard would never read the fine print of a deal presented by his golden son-in-law. So Terrence exploited that blind, arrogant trust. He secretly put up their primary residence as secondary collateral to secure the loan. The words hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the reality struck. Patricia let out a piercing, guttural scream. It was not a gasp of surprise, but a visceral shriek of a woman watching her entire identity, her social standing, and her generational wealth being ripped away in real time. She clutched her chest, rocking back in her leather chair, as if she had been physically struck. The family mansion was her absolute crown jewel, the ultimate symbol of her superiority in her elite social circles. The thought of it being weaponized and lost to cover Terrence's bad debts was completely unfathomable to her. Madison finally turned on her husband. The shock morphed into absolute unadulterated horror. She grabbed Terrence by the arm, shaking him violently, demanding to know if it was true. She screamed at him, her voice cracking, asking how he could possibly sign away her parents' home without telling anyone. Terrence recoiled, his clammy skin shining under the recessed boardroom lighting. He began to stutter, his voice high and pathetic, completely stripped of its usual smooth salesman cadence. He raised his hands defensively, stammering that it was just a temporary measure. He babbled that the clause was merely a banking technicality, a standard operating procedure required by the rigid underwriters to clear the funds. He swore he had a refinancing strategy lined up to release the house within the quarter, claiming the commercial real estate market simply turned against him before he could execute his grand vision. He pleaded with Richard, desperately trying to sell the lie that their home was never in any actual danger. I did not let him finish his pathetic, rambling defense. I placed my hands flat on the cold marble table and leaned forward, bringing my face closer to the center of the room. The absolute authority in my posture immediately silenced Terrence's excuses. I looked directly at my father, who was still staring blankly at the red folder, his chest heaving with silent, ragged breaths. I delivered the final, inescapable truth. I told them it was not a technicality. I explained that a cross-collateralization clause is only a technicality until the primary asset defaults, at which point it becomes a legally binding transfer of ownership. I let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment, ensuring the weight of their total defeat settled deep into their bones. Then I delivered the killing blow. It is not a technicality, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute finality. Because my firm owns the debt, I don't just own the Belmont Plaza today, I own the house you are currently sleeping in. That is a lie. Richard growled, the sound vibrating deep within his chest, before erupting into a full-throated roar. That is an absolute fabricated lie. He bolted out of his leather chair, the heavy piece of furniture skidding backward across the hardwood floor. He pointed a trembling, rigid finger directly at the center of my face, his features contorted in a mix of absolute denial and frantic rage. The sheer impossibility of my statement had triggered a massive defensive response in his brain. He was a man who had spent 40 years building a manufacturing company, a man who prided himself on his meticulous oversight and unyielding control. The concept that he had unwittingly signed away his most prized personal asset was something his ego literally could not process. "I am a seasoned executive, Sydney," Richard bellowed, slamming his hand flat onto the black marble table. "I read every single line of every single contract placed in front of me. I review the fine print. I command a fleet of corporate lawyers who double-check the commas. I would never, under any circumstances, authorize the family estate to be used as collateral for a commercial venture. You are bluffing. You are sitting here trying to terrify your mother and sister with some fabricated corporate ghost story to make yourself look powerful." Patricia immediately seized upon his denial, her survival instinct desperate for any life raft. She let out a sharp, hysterical breath and leaned forward, her eyes wild. "Of course she is bluffing, Richard. Look at her. She is just trying to punish us because she is jealous of Madison. She printed out some fake red folder to scare us. Call the police, Richard. Have her arrested for corporate extortion right now." I did not break eye contact with my father. I let his shouting fade into the heavy, soundproofed walls of the boardroom. I simply stood at the head of the table, perfectly still, watching the violent, panicked flailing of a dying dynasty. "I do not bluff, Dad," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Mitchell." Mitchell did not say a word. He did not engage in the screaming match. He simply reached out and picked up a sleek black remote control resting near the center console. He pressed a single silver button. Instantly, the motorized blackout blinds hissed downward, sealing the boardroom off from the bright morning sun of the Chicago skyline. The massive frosted glass wall behind me darkened, transforming seamlessly into a state-of-the-art, high-definition projection screen. The sudden shift in lighting plunged the room into a cool, cinematic glow, casting sharp shadows across Terrence's sweating, terrified face. A document appeared on the screen, magnified to 10 feet tall. It was a digital scan of the original guarantee and security agreement. The heavy black text was perfectly crisp, outlining the terms of the cross-collateralization. At the bottom of the fourth page, highlighted by a bright yellow digital marker, was the signature line. "There is the commercial loan guarantee," Mitchell stated, his voice ringing with absolute clinical detachment. "Executed 14 months ago. Notarized by a third-party official. Please direct your attention to the primary guarantor signature at the bottom right." Richard stopped breathing. He stumbled forward, bracing his knuckles against the marble table as he stared up at the massive projection. His eyes traced the lines on the screen. There, magnified for the entire room to see, was his exact signature. The aggressive sweeping loop of the capital R, the sharp jagged finish of the final D. It was undeniably, unmistakably his handwriting. "No," Richard whispered the word, slipping out as a hoarse, defeated rasp. He blinked rapidly, stepping closer to the screen as if trying to find the flaw in the pixels. That is my signature. But I never signed that page. I signed the non-disclosure agreements. I signed the character reference forms for the underwriting board. I specifically recall reviewing the packet. I did not sign a pledge for my primary residence. He turned his head slowly, his neck moving mechanically as his horrified gaze locked onto Terrence. Madison followed her father's eyes. She turned to her husband, her face completely drained of color. "Terrence!" She croaked, her voice trembling with rising panic. "Terrence, tell him. Tell him it is a clerical error. Tell him the bank made a mistake with the paperwork." Terrence looked like a man standing on the gallows. His bespoke suit was ruined, entirely soaked through with cold, terrified sweat. He raised his hands in a frantic, placating gesture, his eyes darting wildly between his father-in-law and the giant projected document on the wall. "Richard, listen to me," Terrence babbled, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch. "You know how these massive loan portfolios are. It was a stack of paper 3 inches thick. You were rushing to get to your golf tournament. You were signing rapidly. You must have just flipped past the header and signed it by mistake. It was an oversight. It was just buried in the boilerplate text. I never meant for it to be executed. The bank just slipped it in to secure the margins." It was a spectacular real-time attempt at gaslighting. Even backed into a corner facing the absolute destruction of his life, Terrence could not stop lying. He was desperately trying to convince a man famous for his meticulous control that he had simply been careless. I took 2 slow, deliberate steps around the table, placing myself directly in Terrence's line of sight. I needed him to look at the architect of his total ruin. "You are a terrible liar, Terrence," I said, my tones slicing through his frantic babbling like a scalpel. "And you are a remarkably sloppy criminal." Terrence snapped his mouth shut, swallowing hard as he stared at me, sheer panic vibrating in his pupils. When my acquisitions team flagged the Belmont Plaza file for potential purchase, the cross-collateralization clause immediately stood out. I explained, addressing the room with icy precision. "My father is an arrogant man, but he is fundamentally risk-averse when it comes to his primary tangible assets. I knew immediately that he would never knowingly risk the family mansion for a highly speculative commercial venture run by a man who has failed at 3 previous startups." I looked back at Mitchell. Mitchell pressed the button on the remote again. The projection on the glass wall shifted. The high-definition image of the signature remained, but a thermal color-coded overlay suddenly appeared on top of it, mapping the exact pen pressure and stroke velocity of the ink. It looked like a forensic crime scene analysis. I did not just review the paperwork. I continued, turning my cold gaze back to my father. I ordered a complete independent forensic analysis of the original physical document. We pulled the ink samples. We measured the indentation depth on the paper. I stared dead at Terrence, letting the absolute crushing weight of the moment fall entirely on his shoulders. "A forensic handwriting analyst confirmed that signature was traced. Terrence forged your signature, Dad. That's wire fraud and identity theft, a federal felony." The words "federal felony" acted as an invisible detonator inside the soundproofed walls of the boardroom. The pristine, highly manicured illusion of the Williams family loyalty shattered in a spectacular, instantaneous explosion. For a fraction of a second, the room was suspended in a vacuum of absolute shock. Then the golden child completely lost her mind. Madison let out a sound that was half shriek, half sob, a feral noise that stripped away every ounce of her carefully cultivated country club elegance. She lunged across the narrow space separating her from her husband, her hands heavy with diamond rings purchased with stolen money curled into frantic claws. She threw herself at Terrence, striking his chest with wild, uncoordinated blows. Her fists pounded against his sweat-soaked designer suit, the dull thuds echoing off the glass walls. She was not crying out of concern for her parents losing their home. She was not weeping over the devastating betrayal of her father. She was mourning her own impending poverty. She screamed at him, her voice ragged and hysterical. She wailed about her reputation, her exclusive memberships, and her upcoming luxury vacations. She struck his shoulder, sobbing that he had promised her a billionaire lifestyle that he had sworn his venture capital firm was bringing in 8 figures a year. She beat her hands against his chest, screaming that he had humiliated her, that her friends would drop her the second the news broke, and that he had completely ruined her perfect life. Terrence took the blows for exactly 3 seconds before his own survival instinct finally overpowered his cowardice. The polished aristocratic facade he had maintained since the day he married into the family evaporated completely. He shoved Madison backward with a violent, forceful thrust of his arms. She stumbled on her high heels, crashing hard against the edge of the black marble table. Terrence's face contorted into an ugly, vicious snarl, entirely devoid of the smooth charm he used to swindle investors. His carefully cultivated upper-class mid-Atlantic accent dropped away instantly, revealing a harsh, guttural tone born of pure desperation. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger directly at Madison's face, then swept his arm in a wide arc to include Richard and Patricia. He roared that he was not taking the fall alone. He screamed that their insatiable, bottomless greed had forced his hand from the very beginning. He yelled that Madison demanded million-dollar home renovations, that Patricia required chartered private jets for her weekend shopping trips, and that Richard demanded aggressive, mathematically impossible returns on his initial investments to fuel his own ego. Terrence spat the words at them, shouting that the Williams family had bled him dry to fund a lifestyle none of them could actually afford. He screamed that they had backed him into a corner with their relentless demands for luxury, leaving him with absolutely no choice but to leverage the only asset they had left to steal. Patricia could not handle the sight of her perfect daughter being manhandled and accused. Her maternal instincts, entirely reserved for Madison, flared into overdrive. She scrambled around the massive table, throwing her arms around her hyperventilating daughter. Patricia pulled Madison close to her chest, shielding her from Terrence's verbal assault. She glared at her son-in-law with absolute unadulterated venom. Patricia cried out to the room, her voice shaking with desperate indignation. She declared that her poor baby was a victim. She screamed at Terrence, calling him a monster, a predator, and a common thief who had manipulated his way into their home. She turned her frantic gaze to Richard, insisting that Terrence had completely tricked Madison. She swore that her innocent, trusting daughter had absolutely no idea what this criminal was doing behind closed doors in his office. Patricia begged Richard to see that Madison was just as much a victim of this massive fraud as he was spinning a frantic narrative to save her golden child from the wreckage. I watched this sickening display of selective maternal protection with absolute clinical detachment. Patricia was doing exactly what she had done for 30 years. She was rapidly constructing a protective, impenetrable bubble of denial around Madison to shield her from the consequences of her own actions. It was the exact same dynamic that had defined my entire childhood, the dynamic that ensured Madison was endlessly rewarded while I was endlessly punished. I stepped forward, planting myself at the head of the table. My voice cut through their chaotic, screaming breakdown with the lethal force of a falling guillotine. Madison was not tricked. I stated, the icy precision of my words instantly dropping the temperature in the room. Patricia snapped her mouth shut, her head whipping toward me. Madison stopped sobbing, freezing against her mother's shoulder. My sister is not a naive, innocent housewife playing the victim. I continued, making sure every syllable landed like a physical blow against their delusions. She is not a bystander in this financial crime. According to the corporate filings registered with the state, Madison holds the official title of Chief Financial Officer for Terrence's hollow venture capital firm. The room went deadly quiet. The implication of that title settled heavily over Richard, who slowly lifted his gaze from the table to stare at his eldest daughter. She was not just ignorant of the scheme, I explained, detailing the mechanics of their ruin. She was the primary financial authorizer. She was the one approving the daily expenditures. Madison personally signed the wire transfers that siphoned the commercial loan money out of the Belmont Plaza's operating accounts. She funneled those millions directly out of the business and routed them into her own offshore personal shopping accounts in Paris and Milan. Madison completely froze. The breath hitched violently in her throat. She stared at me with the raw, wide-eyed terror of a trapped animal, realizing the cage had just snapped shut. All the color rushed out of her face, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. I reached out without breaking eye contact with my sister. Mitchell placed the final stack of documents directly into my waiting hand. They were official bank records printed on thick white paper, bearing the unmistakable watermarks of international financial institutions and authorized digital signatures. I placed the stack onto the smooth black marble. With a single decisive push, I slid the wire transfer records across the table directly toward my father. "Review the routing numbers, Dad," I commanded, my voice echoing in the absolute silence. Check the authorizing signatures. Madison is legally complicit in a federal fraud scheme. Richard's bloodshot eyes dragged across the staggering columns of numbers printed on the bank records. He was a man who understood ledgers, who worshipped bottom lines, and the undeniable math staring back at him was apocalyptic. He traced the routing numbers with a trembling, calloused index finger. He saw the exact dates when the commercial loan funds secured by the deed to his own home had been wired into dummy corporate accounts. He saw the secondary transfers authorized by Madison's unmistakable looping signature, funneling millions of dollars into private offshore trusts and high-end Parisian boutiques. It was a flawless, irrefutable paper trail of federal wire fraud authored entirely by his favorite daughter. The realization crushed the last remaining fragments of his patriarchal ego. Richard did not yell. He did not slam his fists. The fight had been completely bled out of him, leaving behind a hollow, aging man. He slumped forward, bracing his elbows on the black marble table, burying his face in his trembling hands. He was paralyzed by the knowledge that his legacy was not destroyed by a faceless corporate entity, but systematically looted by the golden child he had elevated above all others. Beside him, Madison was suffocating on her own panic. Her perfectly styled facade had completely melted away. She clutched her chest, her breathing shallow and rapid, her eyes darting toward the heavy boardroom doors, as if contemplating a physical escape. But there was nowhere to run. Terence had backed himself against the frosted glass wall, shrinking away from the family. He had swindled, utterly silent now that his web of lies had been meticulously dismantled and laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights. The suffocating reality of impending federal indictments, total bankruptcy, and the loss of her social empire finally shattered Patricia's armor of delusion. The arrogant, aristocratic mask she had worn for decades cracked, splintered, and fell away, leaving behind a terrified, desperate woman. She looked at Richard for salvation, but her husband was a broken shell, staring at a stack of wire transfers. She looked at Terence, the son-in-law she had fiercely defended, who was now avoiding her gaze like a coward. Finally, Patricia's wild, panicked eyes locked onto me. The ultimate predator of the Williams family realized she was caught in a lethal trap, and her only possible exit was to grovel to the prey she had spent a lifetime torturing and casting aside. Patricia moved with a sudden frantic energy that defied her usual practiced elegance. She shoved her heavy leather chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the polished hardwood floor. She did not just walk toward me, she practically scrambled around the edge of the massive table. She threw herself downward, the fabric of her expensive designer skirt tearing as she literally dropped to her knees beside my chair. It was a pathetic, visceral display of total submission. Patricia reached out with trembling, manicured hands, her fingers grasping desperately at the lapels of my tailored blazer. Her perfectly applied makeup was running, ruined by hot, frantic tears that spilled down her flushed cheeks. "We're your parents!" Patricia sobbed, her voice a shrill, broken wail that echoed painfully off the soundproofed walls. She tugged at my jacket, trying to force me to look down at her, trying to manufacture a maternal connection that she had systematically destroyed years ago. "You are our daughter. Please, Sydney, don't let them send your sister to prison. Don't take our home." She wept loudly, burying her tear-streaked face against the arm of my chair. This was the woman who had openly mocked my career choices, who had laughed as I was handed the check for a dinner I could not afford, who had proudly watched me get thrown out into the cold. Now she was a millionaire, reduced to begging for scraps of mercy from the child she had branded a failure. I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. I searched myself for a flicker of hesitation, a single drop of familial guilt, or even a fleeting moment of pity. I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional manipulation that had governed my childhood had zero leverage in this room. I placed my hands firmly on the armrests and stood up in one fluid, powerful motion. The sudden, unyielding movement forced Patricia to release her desperate grip on my blazer. She tumbled backward onto the polished hardwood floor, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. I smoothed the pristine fabric of my suit, looking down at her crumpled form, and then shifted my cold gaze to Richard, ensuring they both absorbed every single syllable of their sentencing. "You ceased being my parents the day you handed my inheritance to a con man and told me to pay the dinner bill because I was a disappointment." I stated, my voice echoing with icy final precision. "You bet on the wrong child." The brutal truth hung over the room, an unshakable, lethal verdict. Patricia buried her face in her hands, her sobbing echoing loudly in the quiet space, a stark contrast to the sterile corporate environment. Richard kept his eyes squeezed shut, a solitary tear escaping and rolling down his weathered cheek. The Williams family had entirely imploded, stripped of their wealth, their pride, and their toxic illusions. Mitchell stepped forward smoothly, breaking the heavy, suffocating silence. He moved with the quiet efficiency of an executioner. He pulled back the crisp cuff of his suit jacket and glanced down at his luxury watch with practiced clinical indifference. "We have 15 minutes before I file the foreclosure and forward the forgery evidence to the FBI." Mitchell announced, his voice perfectly level, utterly unmoved by the emotional wreckage scattered across the boardroom. He looked up, his gaze bypassing the weeping women and locking directly onto Richard. "How would you like to proceed?" Mitchell's question hung in the freezing air of the boardroom. 15 minutes, 900 seconds standing between my family's glittering fraudulent empire and total catastrophic annihilation. Richard stared at the digital clock on the wall. The red numbers were a countdown to the end of his life's work. Patricia remained crumpled on the floor, her expensive skirt pooled around her, weeping softly into her hands. Madison was trembling so violently, her teeth were chattering, her terrified gaze bouncing between me and the heavy mahogany doors. Terrence looked physically ill, his skin a sickly pale gray, sweating through his ruined bespoke suit. I stepped away from the head of the table, pacing slowly down the length of the room. My heels clicked against the hardwood, a sharp, rhythmic sound that forced their attention onto me. "I am not an unreasonable woman," I began, my voice perfectly calm, devoid of any vindictive joy. "I am a businesswoman, and as a businesswoman, I always offer options to those sitting across the negotiating table. You have exactly two paths forward. I suggest you listen very carefully, because there will be no negotiations, no extensions, and no third chances." I stopped pacing and turned to face them. "Option A," I said, holding up a single finger. "We let the clock run out. Mitchell transmits the forensic handwriting analysis, the IP logs of the wire transfers, and the sworn affidavits directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We file a civil suit for the immediate foreclosure of the Belmont Plaza and the family estate. The bank takes everything, but that is just the financial ruin. The criminal fallout will be much worse." I walked directly behind Madison's chair. She shrank away from me, pulling her shoulders up to her ears. "Terrence and Madison will be indicted for wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft. You will not face a sympathetic local judge who plays golf with Dad. You will face federal prosecutors who make their careers taking down arrogant, sloppy, white-collar criminals. Your assets will be frozen immediately. You will not be able to afford a defense attorney. You will be assigned a public defender who is handling 80 other cases. You will be convicted. You will spend the next 10 to 15 years in federal prison." Madison let out a sharp, strangled gasp, burying her face against Terrence's shoulder. Terrence squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head in silent, pathetic denial. "And Mom and Dad?" I continued, shifting my gaze to my parents. "You will be dragged through the mud. Your country club memberships will be revoked. Your friends will block your numbers. You will watch your primary residence auctioned off on the courthouse steps for pennies on the dollar, and you will spend your twilight years visiting your golden child through a plexiglass window." Patricia let out a fresh wave of hysterical sobs, pressing her hands over her ears, as if trying to physically block out the reality of her future. "Or," I said, dropping my hand. The word silenced the room instantly. Patricia slowly lowered her hands. Richard lifted his head, his bloodshot eyes locking onto mine with a desperate, pathetic flare of hope. "Option B," I stated, my tone turning strictly clinical. "You sign a deed in lieu of foreclosure right here, right now." I gestured to Mitchell. He unclasped his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, dropping them onto the marble table with a heavy, definitive thud. He slid 4 sleek black pens next to the paper. "By signing these documents," I explained, "you voluntarily surrender the titles of both the Belmont Plaza and the family estate directly to Apex Ventures. You sign over all operating rights, all intellectual property, and all physical assets associated with the properties. In exchange, Apex Ventures will officially forgive the outstanding debt. The commercial loan will be satisfied. Furthermore, I will permanently withhold the forensic forgery evidence from the authorities. The FBI never gets the file. Terrence and Madison do not go to federal prison. You avoid the public trial, the criminal convictions, and the media circus. Terrence let out a massive, shuddering breath, sagging against the glass wall behind him. He looked like a man who had just been granted a stay of execution. Madison wiped her mascara-stained cheeks, a fragile, desperate relief washing over her face. Even Richard seemed to exhale, his rigid shoulders dropping as he looked at the pens resting on the table. They were already rationalizing it. They were already convincing themselves that they could rebuild, that they could leverage their remaining social connections to start over. That losing the real estate was a small price to pay to keep their freedom. They had not heard the catch. I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the black marble, bringing my face level with my father's. But I added, the cold, razor-sharp edge returning to my voice, instantly shattering their momentary relief. If you choose option B, you walk out of these doors with exactly what you gave me 3 years ago. Nothing. Richard's brief flicker of hope died instantly. He raised a trembling hand, gesturing weakly toward the papers. Sydney, be reasonable. Richard pleaded, the authoritative patriarch, completely gone, replaced by a desperate old man begging for scraps. The estate has been in my name for 30 years. It is our home. Your mother has her entire life in that house. Take the commercial properties. Take the plaza. We will sign over the business assets. But leave us the house. You cannot strip us of our primary residence. Where will we go? I did not blink. I did not soften. You should have asked Terrence that question before he forged your signature and leveraged your roof to pay for Madison's shopping sprees. I replied smoothly. The bank does not care about your sentimental attachment to the hardwood floors, Dad. The bank cares about the collateral. And since Apex Ventures now owns that debt, I own the collateral. I am not taking your home. You gave it away. I am simply collecting what is legally mine. Patricia let out another wretched sob, pulling herself up from the floor and leaning heavily against the table. Her perfectly styled hair was a ruined, tangled mess. You cannot do this to us, Sydney, Patricia cried, her voice cracking with pure panic. We will have nothing. No money, no property. Our friends, our social circle, we will be ruined. We will be homeless. How can you be so cruel to your own flesh and blood? Cruel, I echoed, taking a slow step toward her. Cruel was watching you hand Terrence a check for $2 million while telling me I was not smart enough to manage a budget. Cruel was sitting at a restaurant watching you all laugh while handing me a bill that would drain my entire savings account. You chose this. You made Terrence your golden boy because he had the right accent and the right suits. You enabled Madison's greed because you could not bear to tell her no. You built this trap, Mom. I am just the one closing the door. I turned my back on them, looking out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Chicago skyline. The city looked cold, sharp, and indifferent. It was exactly how I had felt the night they threw me out. There is no buyout, I stated, staring at their pathetic reflections in the glass. There is no severance package. There is no grace period. Apex Ventures assumes total ownership of the estate and the commercial properties immediately. Your bank accounts tied to the properties will be seized by my firm the moment the ink is dry. I turned back to face the broken remnants of my family. 3 years ago, you threw me out of the house. You gave me 2 hours to pack a single suitcase. You forced me to sleep in a freezing car because you canceled my credit cards. You left me with absolutely nothing. So that is exactly what you are getting today. If you sign those papers and avoid federal prison, you are surrendering your home. You have exactly 24 hours to pack whatever personal clothing fits into your vehicles. Anything left inside the mansion after that deadline becomes the property of Apex Ventures, and it will be thrown into a dumpster. Mitchell checked his watch again, his voice slicing through the heavy, suffocated silence of the room. We have 8 minutes remaining, Mitchell stated coldly. I suggest you pick up the pens. The quiet ticking of Mitchell's watch seemed to amplify, filling the suffocating silence of the boardroom like the steady strike of a gavel. 8 minutes to choose between poverty and a concrete cell. Richard stared at the 4 black pens aligned perfectly on the marble table. They looked like tiny, sleek weapons. For a man who had spent his entire life wielding his wealth as a blunt instrument to control everyone around him, picking up that pen was equivalent to cutting off his own hands. He looked at me. He searched my face for the submissive, eager-to-please daughter he had bullied for 30 years. He found a wall of absolute stone. I did not blink. I did not offer a single comforting word. I simply waited for him to surrender. A ragged, defeated breath escaped Richard's lungs. His broad shoulders slumped, the last structural pillar of his towering ego snapping under the sheer weight of his predicament. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the first pen. The cap snapped off with a sharp, echoing click. He dragged the document toward him. The header deed in lieu of foreclosure sat glaringly at the top of the page in bold black ink. Richard placed the tip of the pen to the paper. His hand shook so violently that the first stroke of his signature was a jagged, unrecognizable line. He paused, swallowed hard, and forced his hand to move forward. The scratching of the nib against the thick parchment was the only sound in the room. He was signing away the manufacturing empire he had built from scratch, the commercial real estate portfolio he had hoarded for decades, and the illusion of his absolute superiority. He was surrendering it all to the daughter he had deemed worthless. Mitchell silently slid the next stack of papers toward Patricia. This was the transfer of the primary residence, the sprawling family estate in the exclusive suburbs. Patricia stared at the signature line as if it were a venomous snake about to strike. She let out a high, keening whimper. That mansion was her entire identity. It was where she hosted her lavish charity galas, where she paraded her wealth in front of her country club friends, where she had designated Madison's luxurious bridal suite, while relegating me to the cramped guest room over the garage. Signing that paper meant she was nobody. She would be instantly exiled from her elite social circles, reduced to a cautionary tale whispered about over expensive cocktails. She picked up the pen, her perfectly manicured fingers slipping on the smooth barrel. Hot tears cascaded down her cheeks, ruining her expensive silk blouse and leaving dark, wet patches on the fabric. She sobbed uncontrollably, her chest heaving with every ragged breath. She looked up at Richard for a reprieve, begging him with her eyes to find another way out, but he kept his gaze glued to the marble table, utterly broken. With a final agonizing gasp, Patricia pressed the pen to the paper and signed her name. The sweeping, arrogant signature she usually used on massive charity checks was reduced to a pathetic, shaky scrawl. She dropped the pen and covered her face, weeping violently into her palms. Mitchell efficiently retrieved the signed documents and moved down the length of the table. He placed the commercial loan forgiveness agreements in front of Terrence and Madison. This was the document that shielded them from the FBI, trading their immediate freedom for the total forfeiture of their stolen assets. Madison stared at the papers. The hysterical sobbing that had racked her body just moments ago suddenly vanished. A cold, calculating realization washed over her features. She was no longer a wealthy heiress. She was no longer the pampered wife of a billionaire venture capitalist. She was tethered to a disgraced, penniless fraudster. Her survival instinct, honed by years of my mother's country club grooming, kicked into high gear. She did not pick up the pen. Instead, she lifted her chin, her tear-streaked face hardening into a mask of pure, self-serving ice. She turned her back entirely on Terrence and looked directly at Mitchell. "Draft the divorce papers," Madison demanded, her voice completely devoid of the panic from 2 minutes ago. "I want them drawn up immediately. I want it clearly stated that I was entirely manipulated into signing those wire transfers under extreme emotional duress. I want a complete dissolution of this marriage filed with the state by the end of the day." Terrence slowly turned his head to look at his wife. For a long moment he just stared at her, absorbing the absolute speed of her betrayal. The golden couple, the flawless partnership that my parents had endlessly celebrated and shoved in my face, had dissolved the exact second the money ran out. Terrence threw his head back and let out a loud, hollow burst of laughter. It was a bitter, mocking sound that scraped aggressively against the walls of the boardroom. "Incredible," Terrence sneered, shaking his head. He dropped his aristocratic posture, completely leaning casually against the table. "Not even 10 minutes of being broke, and you are already jumping ship. You happily spent millions of stolen dollars on designer clothes and first-class tickets to Paris Madison. You knew exactly where the cash was coming from every time you authorized a transfer. Do not play the innocent victim now just because the credit cards are maxed out. You lied to me," Madison shrieked, her cold facade cracking as she glared at him with pure hatred. You ruined my life. I will not go to a federal prison for you. I will not go down with you. You are already down, sweetheart, Terrence mocked, picking up the pen. We both are. He aggressively signed his name on the line, tossing the pen onto the documents with a sharp clatter. Madison snatched up her own pen, her face tight with fury, and aggressively signed her portion of the surrender. She shoved the papers back toward Mitchell, refusing to even look at her husband again. Mitchell gathered the scattered documents. He meticulously aligned the corners, tapping the heavy stack against the marble table. He reviewed every signature, verifying that the transfer of power was absolute and legally binding. He then extracted one final sheet of paper from the bottom of his leather briefcase. It was the Master Surrender Agreement, the final document that legally bound all the previous transfers together and finalized the total handover to Apex Ventures. Mitchell placed it directly in front of Richard. My father looked at the single sheet of paper. He had aged 20 years in the span of an hour. The arrogant tyrant who had routinely dismissed my entire existence was gone. He picked up the pen for the last time. His hand moved slowly, heavily as he signed his name on the final page, officially finalizing his own destruction. He dropped the pen. It rolled across the smooth marble and bumped against my hand. Richard slowly looked up at me. His eyes were completely hollow, stripped of everything he had once held dear. You destroyed this family, he whispered. I picked up the document. No, I just audited it. The rot was already there. The morning sun offered no warmth as my black SUV rolled up the winding, meticulously manicured driveway of the Williams family estate. Behind me, 3 identical vehicles followed in a tight, disciplined convoy. We parked in a synchronized line in front of the grand portico. Mitchell stepped out first, adjusting his pristine suit jacket, followed immediately by 6 private security contractors dressed in tactical black. We walked up the sweeping marble steps, the heavy uniform thud of our boots echoing aggressively against the towering white columns. I did not knock. I simply turned the heavy brass handle and pushed the custom oak doors open. The scene inside the grand foyer was a masterpiece of poetic justice. The sprawling, opulent entryway was completely unrecognizable. The people who had spent their entire lives treating everyone around them like disposable servants were now experiencing the brutal, unfiltered reality of having absolutely nothing. Without the funds to hire a premium moving service, Richard and Patricia were reduced to manual labor. Black plastic garbage bags and cheap mismatched cardboard boxes littered the imported Italian tile. Richard was on his knees. The man who had built his entire identity on pride, wealth, and absolute control was reduced to a sweating, red-faced shell. He was awkwardly wrestling a stack of bespoke Italian suits into a flimsy box that looked like it had been salvaged from a grocery store dumpster. The veins in his neck bulged with the effort and the sheer crushing humiliation of his new reality. Patricia was frantically rushing up and down the grand staircase, her arms overflowing with silk blouses, cashmere sweaters, and velvet hangers. Her breathing was ragged, her face a mask of smeared makeup and pure, unadulterated panic. Madison was sitting directly on the floor of the formal living room, surrounded by a mountain of designer handbags. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her chest heaving as she tried to shove thousands of dollars worth of luxury leather into a plastic trash bag. I walked slowly into the center of the foyer, my security team instantly fanning out to secure the perimeter of the ground floor. Patricia froze on the landing, her eyes locked onto me wide with terror before she suddenly dropped her pile of clothes. She sprinted toward the formal dining room. I followed her at a measured, unhurried pace. I found her standing unsteadily on a velvet dining chair. Her hands were desperately clawing at the heavy gilded frame of a massive 18th century oil painting that hung above the stone fireplace. It was an antique she frequently boasted about to her country club friends, a piece valued in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Take your hands off that frame, I commanded, my voice slicing through the frantic, chaotic noise of the house. Patricia gasped, nearly losing her balance on the expensive chair. She clutched the gold frame tighter, her knuckles turning stark white. It is mine, she cried, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. I bought this at auction. You cannot take my art, Sydney. I need something to start over with. I am taking it. I signaled to 2 of the security guards. They stepped forward, instantly flanking the chair with imposing stillness. That belongs to the estate now. I stated, staring dead into her panicked eyes. Put it back. Patricia let out a pathetic wail, refusing to release her desperate grip. You have no right to do this to your own mother. Remember when you sold my grandmother's piano to pay for Madison's trip to Cabo? I asked, my tone dropping to an absolute freezing calm. Now you know how it feels, no? The sheer immovable authority in the room crushed her remaining resistance. She let go of the heavy frame, her shoulders shaking with violent sobs, and allowed the guards to guide her off the chair. I left her weeping in the dining room and walked back into the foyer. Where is your husband, Madison? I asked, looking down at my sister, who was now throwing crushed, diamond-encrusted heels across the room. He seems uniquely absent for a man who has exactly 30 minutes left to vacate the premises. Madison looked up, her face tight with venom. I do not know, and I do not care, she spat, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. He told me he was going to the garage to find more boxes. I am divorcing him. He ruined my life. She was lying, or rather, Terrence had lied to her. A man like Terrence did not look for boxes while the ship was sinking. Mitchell stepped into the foyer from the kitchen hallway. He tapped his earpiece, listening intently for a second, before turning his clinical gaze to me. Perimeter team just flagged a breach. Mitchell reported, his voice echoing perfectly in the vaulted space. Someone is attempting to exit through the servants' quarters at the rear of the property. I did not waste a single second. I walked briskly through the massive chef's kitchen, bypassing the marble islands, heading straight for the narrow back hallway that led to the service exit. Mitchell and 2 guards flanked me. We pushed open the heavy security door just as Terrence was wrestling with the exterior gate latch. He was completely out of breath, his face slick with nervous sweat. He was not carrying a garbage bag of clothes. He was gripping a heavy, reinforced canvas duffel bag, the thick strap digging deeply into his shoulder. Going somewhere, Terrence? I asked, stepping out onto the cold stone patio. Terrence jumped, letting out a sharp, undignified yelp. He spun around, clutching the duffel bag tightly against his chest. His eyes darted wildly between me, Mitchell, and the heavily armed security guards blocking his only path to the street. He realized instantly that he was completely trapped. I am just leaving. Terrence stammered, his voice an octave higher than normal. You gave us 24 hours. I am vacating the property. Let me pass. You are vacating, I agreed smoothly. But that bag stays. Terrence took a frantic step backward, shaking his head rapidly. These are my personal effects, my legal documents. You have no right to search my property without a warrant. Actually, Terrence, under the terms of the surrender agreement you signed yesterday, every physical asset on this property currently belongs to Apex Ventures. Mitchell corrected, his tone as sharp as a scalpel. Drop the bag. Terrence refused. His grip tightened, his knuckles turning stark white. He looked like a cornered rat calculating the distance to the fence. He never got the chance to run. I gave a single nod. The 2 security contractors moved with brutal, terrifying efficiency. They closed the distance in 2 strides, grabbing Terrence by the shoulders and forcefully pinning him against the brick wall of the estate. The heavy duffel bag slipped from his grasp, hitting the stone patio with a distinct, muffled thud. Mitchell stepped forward and knelt beside the bag. He unzipped the heavy canvas. The sharp sound of the zipper revealed exactly what Terrence had prioritized over his wife and his in-laws. The bag was packed to the brim with tightly bound stacks of $100 bills, velvet jewelry boxes, and several heavy gold watches. It was the emergency cash reserve Richard had kept hidden in the floor safe, the final remnants of the family's liquid wealth. Terrence was robbing his own family blind while they packed garbage bags in the foyer. Terrence struggled against the guards, his face turning a furious shade of purple. That is mine. I earned that money. You cannot leave me with nothing. You earned absolutely nothing, I said, walking up to him and looking directly into his panicked eyes. You stole it. And this, I gestured to the open bag of cash, is stolen collateral. It belongs to the bank, which means it belongs to me. I turned to the security team. Escort him off the property line. Do not let him back inside. My car, Terrence shouted, his voice cracking into a pathetic shriek as the guards began dragging him down the long driveway toward the main gates. The keys are inside. I need my car. The cars are registered to the estate, Terrence, I called out, watching his frantic, struggling retreat. You will have to walk. The morning sun did nothing to improve the bleak facade of the Belmont Plaza. Standing in the center of the cracked, weed-choked parking lot, I surveyed the commercial estate that was supposed to be the crown jewel of my father's portfolio. It was a decaying monument to Terrence's unchecked greed and my parents' willful ignorance. The exterior paint was peeling in large leprous strips. Several of the large display windows were boarded up with cheap plywood, and the neon letters on the main marquee flickered erratically before dying out entirely. Terrence had not reinvested a single dollar into the property maintenance. He had bled the plaza entirely dry, siphoning the tenants' hard-earned rent directly into offshore accounts to fund Madison's Parisian shopping sprees and his own hidden cash reserves. Mitchell stood beside me holding a thick ledger containing the commercial leases. He looked at the crumbling brickwork with a mixture of professional disgust and clinical calculation. We walked through the sliding glass doors into the main central atrium. The air inside smelled of dust, stale coffee, and quiet desperation. I had instructed Mitchell to summon every current leaseholder to the central plaza at 9 in the morning. They were already waiting. About 40 business owners stood huddled together near the dry, broken fountain in the center of the concourse. They looked completely terrified. I recognized a few of them from years ago: bakery owners, independent bookstore operators, family restaurateurs who had poured their life savings into their storefronts. They clutched their lease agreements tightly to their chests, their faces pale and drawn. The rumor mill had undoubtedly been churning. They knew the Williams family had been ousted. They knew an aggressive corporate entity called Apex Ventures had seized total control of the property. They fully expected me to be the executioner arriving to double their rents, enforce immediate evictions, and sell the prime real estate to luxury developers. I stepped up onto the raised stone platform of the broken fountain, ensuring every person in the atrium could see and hear me clearly. The anxious murmurs died, instantly replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. I looked at the tired, anxious faces staring back at me. These people were collateral damage in my family's fraudulent schemes. Terrence had treated them like an ATM, ignoring their maintenance requests, slapping them with arbitrary late fees, and crushing their profit margins under predatory lease addendums. My father had allowed it to happen as long as his monthly dividends cleared the bank. "My name is Sydney," I began, my voice projecting clearly across the dusty atrium. "I am the chief executive of Apex Ventures, and as of yesterday afternoon, I am the sole owner of the Belmont Plaza. I know exactly what you are expecting this morning. You are expecting me to hand out eviction notices. You are expecting rent hikes. You are expecting to pay the price for the gross financial negligence of the previous management." A few of the tenants shifted uncomfortably, bracing for the impact. An older woman near the front, the owner of the corner floral shop, blinked back tears, her grip tightening on her purse. Her business had been a staple in this community for 2 decades, and she clearly believed today was her final day of operation. "That is not going to happen," I stated flatly. A ripple of confused shock swept through the crowd. People exchanged bewildered glances, unsure if they had heard me correctly. "The previous management treated this property and your businesses as a personal piggy bank." I continued, my tone ringing with absolute authority. "That era ended yesterday. I am a businesswoman, and I know that a commercial property is only as valuable as the businesses that occupy it. You cannot thrive in a building that is falling apart, and you cannot grow when you are being suffocated by predatory fees. Therefore, effective immediately, every single lease agreement in this building is being restructured." I gestured to Mitchell, who unzipped his briefcase and brought out a thick stack of pristine, freshly printed contracts. "I am lowering all base rents by 20% across the board," I announced, the words striking the crowd like a lightning bolt. "I am permanently voiding every punitive penalty clause and exorbitant maintenance fee inserted by Terrence over the last 3 years. Furthermore, Apex Ventures is injecting $5 million into an immediate comprehensive renovation of the Belmont Plaza. We are replacing the roof. We are repaving the lot. We are upgrading the security and electrical systems. You will not pay a single cent for these upgrades. I want this plaza to be the premier commercial destination in the district, and I want all of you to stay and reap the profits." Total silence reigned for exactly 3 seconds. Then the atrium erupted. The older florist burst into relieved tears, burying her face in her hands. The restaurant owners cheered, clapping each other on the back. The sheer, overwhelming wave of relief and gratitude was palpable, transforming the stale air of the decaying building. They had walked in expecting financial ruin, and they were walking out with a lifeline. I watched them celebrate, feeling a profound, quiet satisfaction. I had not just secured my financial empire. I had systematically dismantled the toxic legacy my father had built and replaced it with absolute loyalty. These tenants would go to war for me now. As the crowd began to disperse, lining up eagerly at Mitchell's makeshift desk to sign their new, highly favorable leases, a man detached himself from the shadows near the entrance and walked purposefully toward me. He was young, wearing a sharp but inexpensive suit, holding a digital recorder and a notepad. "Sydney," he said, stopping a few feet away. "Mark Evans, Chicago Business Tribune. That was quite a speech. Very Robin Hood of you." I looked at him coldly. "It is not charity, Mr. Evans. It is smart business. Dead businesses do not pay rent." He smirked slightly, clicking his pen. "Maybe. But I am not here to write about your philanthropic leasing strategies. I have been following the paper trail for the last 48 hours. The sudden foreclosure proceedings, the rapid transfer of the Williams family estate, Richard Williams losing his entire portfolio overnight to an obscure firm called Apex Ventures. Now I find out his estranged daughter is the CEO pulling the strings. My editor wants the cover story for tomorrow's edition. We are calling it The Hostile Family Takeover. Care to give me a quote on how it feels to completely destroy your own father?" He held up the digital recorder, a hungry, predatory look in his eyes. He thought he had cornered me. He thought I would dodge the question, offer a generic public relations statement, or threaten legal action. He severely underestimated the woman he was dealing with. I did not back down. I stepped directly into his personal space, forcing him to look up slightly to meet my gaze. "You can turn off the recorder, Mark, because I am going to dictate exactly what you will publish tomorrow morning," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, unwavering register. "You will not call it a hostile family takeover. You will not paint Richard Williams as a tragic victim of a ruthless daughter. If you do, I will buy your newspaper by noon tomorrow and fire you before lunch." He swallowed hard, the smirk vanishing instantly from his face. His hand twitched slightly, lowering the recorder as the reality of my threat sank in. "The headline you are going to use is Apex Ventures Rescues Failing Belmont Estate," I instructed, articulating every word with crystal clarity. "Your article will detail how a grossly mismanaged, financially insolvent portfolio was saved from total collapse and federal intervention by swift, decisive corporate action. You will focus on the $5 million community revitalization project I just announced. You will highlight the 20% rent reduction saving local jobs. You will make it abundantly clear that the Williams legacy failed because of sheer incompetence and greed, and that Apex Ventures stepped in to clean up the mess. That is the only story. Do we understand each other?" Mark Evans stared at me. He looked at the celebrating tenants behind me, then back at my unyielding expression. He recognized that he was standing in front of a force of nature that had just wiped a billionaire off the map without breaking a single sweat. He nodded slowly, clicking his pen closed and tucking the recorder away. "Loud and clear, Apex Ventures rescues the estate." "Good," I said, turning away from him to survey my property. "Make sure you spell my name correctly." 6 months is a very short amount of time to rebuild an empire, but it is more than enough time to watch a rotten one completely disintegrate. I sat at the expansive mahogany desk in my penthouse office, the morning sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Resting perfectly centered on the pristine leather blotter was a freshly printed copy of the Chicago Business Tribune. The headline dominated the front page in bold, undeniable print. "Apex Ventures revives the Belmont." Mark Evans had followed my instructions to the exact letter. The article detailed the staggering turnaround of the Belmont Plaza. It highlighted the newly paved lots, the modernized security systems, and the thriving ecosystem of local businesses that had previously been suffocating under Terrence's predatory leases. The financial sector was loudly lauding me as a real estate genius, a visionary who had swooped in to salvage a mismanaged, failing portfolio from the brink of total collapse. There was absolutely no mention of a hostile family takeover. There were no sympathetic quotes from a fallen patriarch. My parents were reduced to a vague, unnamed footnote of corporate incompetence. While I was drinking premium black coffee and reviewing soaring quarterly profit margins, Richard and Patricia were waking up to a vastly different reality. 30 miles away in a cramped two-bedroom apartment located in a heavily industrialized sector of the city, the former king and queen of Chicago real estate were suffocating in their new kingdom. The walls were paper-thin, vibrating violently every time the elevated train rattled past the foggy windows. The smell of boiled cabbage and stale cigarette smoke from the hallway constantly seeped beneath their chipped front door. "I cannot live like this for another single day, Richard," Patricia shrieked, slamming a cheap aluminum frying pan onto the stained Formica countertop. The water pressure in the shower is practically non-existent. The neighbors were screaming at each other until 4 in the morning, and the heating unit sounds like it is going to explode. Richard sat at a small, wobbly card table staring blankly at a stack of past-due utility bills. He wore a faded, stretched-out polo shirt, a stark contrast to his formerly endless supply of tailored Italian suits. "Then fix it yourself, Patricia." Richard snapped, his voice thick with exhausted bitterness. "Call the super. Complain to the landlord. Do you think I enjoy freezing in this concrete box? Do you think I want to hear the trains?" "You were supposed to protect us," Patricia yelled, throwing her hands in the air. "You were the great Richard Williams. You were supposed to have offshore accounts, emergency funds, something. We are eating canned soup, Richard. I had to sell my engagement ring to pay the security deposit on this miserable dump. I trusted the son-in-law you insisted we bring into the fold." Richard roared back, slamming his fist onto the wobbly table. "You were the one who worshipped Terrence. You were the one who constantly pushed Madison to marry him because he looked good at the country club. He bled us dry and you cheered him on. Do not blame me for your catastrophic failures." Patricia shrieked, her face turning an ugly, mottled red. "You signed those papers. You handed everything to Sydney. You gave up. She had us dead to rights," Richard growled, dragging his hands over his face. "We had absolutely nothing left to fight with." While my parents tore each other apart in a squalid kitchen, their precious golden child was experiencing her own spectacular fall from grace. Madison stood behind a scuffed laminate counter at a low-end discount retail store on the outskirts of the city. She was wearing a stiff, scratchy polyester uniform polo in a hideous shade of neon green. Her perfectly manicured nails were long gone, replaced by chipped polish and raw cuticles. "This coupon expired 3 weeks ago," Madison said, her voice monotone and drained of all its former aristocratic arrogance. The customer, an angry woman holding a cheap plastic toaster, slammed her hand on the counter. "The sign outside says you take all competitors' coupons. Are you stupid or just blind? Call your manager." Madison closed her eyes, swallowing the sharp, burning lump of humiliation in her throat. 6 months ago, she would have scoffed at a woman like this from the window of a chauffeured town car. Now she had to force a tight, painful smile and apologize. "I will get the manager," Madison whispered, turning away from the register. She retreated to the cramped, windowless break room and sank into a cheap plastic folding chair. She opened her locker, staring at the canvas tote bag resting inside. It was a cruel reminder of the day the repo men arrived at her luxury apartment. They had not just taken the cars and the furniture, they had methodically confiscated her entire collection of designer handbags, stripping away the very items she had used to define her self-worth. She had wept as they carried away hundreds of thousands of dollars in imported leather, leaving her with absolutely nothing. She pulled out her cracked smartphone and stared at the screen. She could not even call Terrence to scream at him. Her soon-to-be ex-husband was currently fighting a losing battle to stay out of a federal penitentiary. The IRS had launched a massive, aggressive investigation into a completely separate tax evasion scheme Terrence had been running before he even met Madison. Federal agents had frozen his remaining hidden accounts, seized his passport, and slapped him with an indictment that carried a mandatory 20-year minimum sentence. He was ruined, and he had dragged her down into the mud with him. I sat back in my plush leather office chair, turning my attention away from the newspaper. The digital clock on my desk ticked silently. My private cell phone, a number known only to a select few, began to vibrate against the mahogany wood. The caller ID displayed an unknown local number. I did not answer. I simply watched the screen until the vibrating stopped and a voicemail notification popped up. I tapped the screen, putting the message on speakerphone. The audio was filled with the sound of a rattling train in the background. "Sydney, Patricia's voice filled my pristine office. She was weeping, her tone entirely stripped of its usual entitlement, reduced to a pathetic, ragged plea. "Sydney, please. It is your mother. Please pick up. We have nothing left. We cannot pay the electric bill. I am so cold. Please, you have so much now. Just send a little allowance. Just a few thousand a month. I am begging you, Sydney. We are starving." I listened to her desperate sobs for a moment, analyzing the absolute lack of genuine remorse. She was not sorry for what she had done. She was only sorry that she was experiencing the consequences. I reached out and tapped the red button on the screen. The message deleted instantly, leaving my office in perfect, undisturbed silence. The twilight air sweeping off the dark, churning expanse of Lake Michigan carried the crisp, metallic scent of impending winter, but the ambient heating on my wraparound terrace kept the chill entirely at bay. Standing at the edge of the reinforced glass balustrade, I looked down at the glittering, sprawling grid of the Chicago skyline. From the vantage point of my $10 million penthouse on the 65th floor, the city did not look like a chaotic labyrinth of concrete and steel. It looked like a chessboard. And for the first time in my life, I held all the winning pieces. 6 months had passed since the morning I seized the Belmont Plaza. True to his word, Mark Evans had run the cover story exactly as I dictated. Apex Ventures revives the Belmont had dominated the business news cycles, cementing my reputation not as a ruthless corporate raider, but as a visionary real estate savior. The market had responded with overwhelming enthusiasm, and my independent portfolio was now an untouchable titan in the commercial sector. I had completely stripped my father's toxic legacy down to the studs and rebuilt it into an empire of my own making. 30 miles south of my pristine sanctuary, the reality of my corporate victory was playing out in a cramped two-bedroom apartment in the city's most unforgiving industrial district. "I cannot breathe in this concrete box, Richard," Patricia shrieked, the sound of her voice competing with the rattling roar of an elevated train passing right outside their clouded, unwashed window. "The radiator has been broken for 3 days. My hands are literally freezing." "Then put on a sweater, Patricia," Richard roared back, slamming a stack of past-due utility bills onto a wobbly laminate kitchen table. He was wearing a faded, oversized t-shirt completely stripped of his former tailored prestige and country club arrogance. "I'm trying to figure out how we keep the electricity on through the weekend. Stop screaming at me." "You were supposed to be a titan," she cried, throwing a cheap aluminum pot into the stained sink with a loud clatter. "You were supposed to have offshore accounts. Emergency funds. We are eating canned soup, Richard. I had to sell my grandmother's pearls just to pay the security deposit for this miserable dump." "I trusted the son-in-law you worshipped," Richard snarled, his face turning an unhealthy shade of purple. "You were the one who pushed Madison to marry Terrence because he looked good at your charity galas. He embezzled everything right under our noses, and you applauded him. Across the city, their precious golden child was experiencing her own spectacular freefall." Madison sat hunched behind the receptionist desk of a low-end discount retail store. She wore a scratchy neon green uniform polo, her posture screaming of utter defeat. Her perfectly manicured hands were raw and bare, typing frantically into a cheap computer terminal as impatient customers pushed squeaking shopping carts past her desk. "No, I cannot hold," Madison hissed into her headset, keeping her voice low and frantic. "I need to speak to the federal prosecutor handling Terrence's case. You cannot freeze my personal checking account. I had nothing to do with his separate tax evasion scheme. He lied to the IRS before we were even married. Hello." She slammed the phone down, burying her face in her hands. She glanced at the empty spot under her desk where she used to keep her imported leather purses. The repo men had taken every single designer bag she owned a month ago, loading hundreds of thousands of dollars of luxury leather into a moving truck while she wept on the pavement. She was left with nothing but a canvas grocery tote and a mountain of legal debt from a husband facing 20 years in federal prison. Back in the dingy apartment, Patricia finally broke. The relentless noise, the freezing air, and the crushing weight of true, inescapable poverty shattered the last remaining fragments of her aristocratic pride. Desperate, shivering, and unable to handle the consequences of her own actions for one more second, she dug her phone out of her pocket. Her trembling fingers scrolled past the blocked numbers and the disconnected lines, finally landing on a private contact she had sworn never to use. She pressed call. High above the chaos, the quiet, comfortable silence of my penthouse terrace was abruptly broken by the sharp vibration of my private cell phone resting on the marble patio table. I took a slow, measured sip from a crystal glass of aged Bordeaux. I did not rush to answer the phone. I let it vibrate, watching the caller ID flash against the dark screen. The buzzing stopped, replaced a moment later by the distinct chime of a new voicemail. I set my wine glass down next to the phone. I tapped the screen, selected the audio file, and pressed play. Sydney. Patricia's voice spilled out of the high-fidelity speaker, grating and discordant. She was sobbing, but it was not the elegant, practiced crying she used to employ to garner sympathy. This was a ragged, wet, utterly broken sound. "Sydney, please!" Patricia gasped, her breath catching in her throat as the loud screech of the elevated train momentarily drowned out her words. "Please, you have to answer. You have to call me back. I cannot take this anymore." I leaned against the glass railing, my expression completely neutral, listening to the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel invisible. "Your father is impossible." Patricia wept, her voice escalating into a frantic whine. "He just sits in the dark all day. Madison lost everything. The IRS took all her accounts. We cannot pay the rent this month, Sydney. They are going to evict us. We are going to be on the street." There was a pause filled only by the sound of her frantic sniffling breaths. "I am your mother," she pleaded, dropping her voice into a register of heavy manipulative guilt. "I carried you. I raised you. I know things got difficult, but we are family. Family forgives. I saw the article. I know how much you are worth now. Just send a little allowance. You would not even notice it. Just a few thousand a month. Please, Sydney, I am begging you. Forgive us. Help us." The voicemail clicked off. The automated system prompted me to save or delete. I stood motionless in the cool evening air. For 30 years, hearing that tone of voice from my mother would have sent a spike of pure anxiety straight through my chest. I would have scrambled to comply, feeling the crushing weight of obligation and the deeply ingrained belief that my sole purpose was to sacrifice for the Williams family image. I searched myself for that familiar panic. I looked for the anger, the bitter resentment, the desire to scream back at her and list every single atrocity she had ever committed against me. I looked for pity. I found absolutely nothing. The void where my childhood trauma used to reside was completely empty. In its place was an absolute unshakable peace. It was a physical sensation, a lightness in my bones. Patricia was no longer a terrifying matriarch. She was just a stranger leaving a desperate message on the wrong phone. I picked up the device. With a single deliberate tap, I deleted the voicemail. I opened the contact settings and pressed the red text that read, "Block caller." The action was permanent. The cord was finally, irreversibly cut. I picked up my wine glass and walked back through the sliding glass doors into the warmth of the penthouse. Mitchell sat on a sleek leather sofa in the center of the living room. He wore his usual impeccably tailored suit, a tablet balanced on his knee, surrounded by a dozen thick physical dossiers outlining our aggressive expansion strategy. He noted the phone in my hand, reading the subtle shift in the atmosphere. "Did they call?" Mitchell asked, his voice steady and professional. I dropped the phone into my designer purse resting on the entryway console. It hit the bottom with a dull, final thud. I walked over to the sofa, taking a slow, savoring sip of the expensive wine, feeling the rich warmth settle in my chest. "Nobody called," I said smoothly, my voice carrying the absolute certainty of a woman who owned her own destiny. "Just a wrong number." I set the glass down and gestured toward the stack of thick acquisition files resting on the coffee table. "Now," I continued, leaning forward with predatory focus, "what is the next property on our list?" I turned my head slightly, catching my reflection in the massive glass windows. Beyond my own confident, unbothered image, the city of Chicago stretched out into the infinite darkness. I looked out over the empire I had conquered, independent, wildly wealthy, and entirely free from the toxicity of my past. The story of Sydney's triumph over her family's corrupt empire offers a profound lesson. True peace comes from severing ties with toxicity, not from seeking validation. For years, her parents and sister expected her to bend to their manipulative demands, leveraging family guilt to mask their own greed. By restructuring the Belmont Plaza and prioritizing her tenants over her father's ego, Sydney proved her worth through impactful action rather than begging for their approval. When she finally blocked her mother's desperate manipulative call, she realized that unapologetically walking away is the ultimate victory. Tell me about a time you had to set a difficult boundary to protect your own peace in the comments below.